It was born in fire in the foundries of Kharkov, beneath the thunder of approaching war, and it would go on to change the very shape of the battlefield. The T-34 was not just a tank, it was a symbol of defiance, of endurance, of a nation's will to survive. When the German armies rolled across the Soviet frontier in 1941, sweeping aside everything in their path, the T-34 rose from the smoke and ruin like an iron phoenix. It was fast, deadly, and impossibly resilient, a machine that would come to define not only the Eastern Front, but the soul of the Soviet Union itself. In its steel heart beat the strength of the workers who built it, the soldiers who fought in it, and the nation that refused to fall. To the Germans, it was a shock, a tank that defied every calculation. To the world, it became legend. This is the story of the T-34, the tank that saved a nation. When Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, he expected a swift and total victory. The Soviet Union, he believed, was a colossus with feet of clay, disorganized, under-equipped, and easy to crush. For the first few weeks, he seemed right. The Red Army was shattered. Millions were captured. Entire divisions vanished in encirclements. Cities burned and the Wehrmacht surged ever eastward toward Moscow. But then, amid the chaos, the Germans encountered something they had never seen before, a tank that could move faster, hit harder, and survive what should have been certain destruction. Its sloped armor deflected shells that would have torn through anything else. Its gun, a 76.2 mm cannon, could destroy any German tank at range, and it moved through mud and snow with the grace of a predator. The soldiers who first faced it in the fields of Smolensk and near Mtsensk were stunned. They radioed back one word again and again: unbekannt, unknown. The myth of invincibility began to crack. The T-34 had not been born by accident. Its origins lay in the 1930s, when Soviet designers led by Mikhail Koshkin and Alexander Morozov sought to build a new kind of fighting machine, one that combined mobility, protection, and firepower in perfect balance. They tested it in secrecy, driving prototypes across thousands of kilometers of swamps, forests, and steppe. When it was finally approved for production in 1940, it was revolutionary: sloped armor at 45 degrees, wide tracks for traction in mud and snow, and a diesel engine that made it faster and safer than any tank in existence. But war came too soon. When the Germans invaded, only about 1,000 T-34s were ready, scattered across a front thousands of miles wide. Yet even in those desperate early months, their impact was seismic. They shocked the enemy, inspired their comrades, and gave the Soviet people a glimpse of hope amid catastrophe. So the war deepened. The T-34 became more than a weapon. It became the beating heart of Soviet resistance. While factories in the West fell to German hands, entire production lines were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and sent east to the Urals. There, under snow and starvation, workers rebuilt the industry from nothing. Men and women worked 12, 14, 16 hours a day in unheated workshops, hammering steel into shape while bombs fell overhead. Children cleaned engine parts. Engineers slept beside their machines, and the tanks rolled out, one after another, an unending tide of steel. Each T-34 was a promise that the Soviet Union would not die, that the Red Army would return. On the battlefield, the T-34 was unmatched. It could fight in conditions that crippled the enemy, through the frozen hell of Stalingrad, the endless mud of Kursk, the snowbound forests of Karelia. It was the spearhead of Soviet counterattacks, its crews charging through smoke and shellfire with a determination that bordered on madness. In the summer of 1943, at Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, thousands of T-34s met the might of Hitler's newest armored beasts, the Tigers and Panthers. The T-34s were outgunned, out-armored, but not outnumbered. Their crews fought with fury and sacrifice, overwhelming the enemy through sheer will and endless waves of steel. Kursk ended not just as a victory, but as proof that the Soviet machine, both human and mechanical, could outlast and outfight the Reich. Over the course of the war, the T-34 evolved. Its gun was upgraded to the more powerful 85 mm, its armor thickened, its systems refined. It became the T-34-85, the final and most famous variant, the tank that would roll through Berlin in 1945. By the end of the war, over 57,000 T-34 had been built, more than any other tank in history up to that point. It was the backbone of the Red Army, the hammer that broke the Wehrmacht, and the steel banner of Soviet victory. Its silhouette, low, angular, defiant, came to symbolize the power of ordinary people united by purpose and endurance. But beyond its technical achievements, the true legacy of the T-34 lies in what it represented. It was a weapon of necessity, born in crisis, shaped by hardship, and perfected in the crucible of total war. It embodied the Soviet spirit, simple, resilient, relentless. It was not beautiful like the German Panther or massive like the Tiger. It was practical, purposeful, human. It could be repaired in the field, driven by barely trained crews, and built faster than its enemies could destroy it. In that simplicity lay its genius. The T-34 was not the best tank in every category, but it was the right tank at the right time for the right war. And in that, it saved not only a nation, but perhaps the world. Tonight, we journey back through the smoke and steel, through the factories and the front lines, to uncover the story of the tank that turned the tide of history. This is the entire story of the T-34, the machine that carried a nation on its tracks, defied annihilation, and became the beating heart of victory. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you tonight? Morning light spread quietly over the vast plains of the Soviet Union, where the land itself seemed to breathe after years of turmoil. Villages stirred beneath the pale sky, their rooftops dusted with frost, their streets echoing faintly with the sounds of buckets, boots, and distant train whistles. There was hunger still, and silence where laughter had once been, but beneath the weight of survival, a gentler rhythm began to return. Smoke drifted from half-built factories, thin and hesitant, like the first breath after long illness. In cities that were once scarred by famine and suspicion, men in long coats walked with papers clutched close to their hearts, as though guarding the fragile promise of the future. Each street carried the scent of iron and dust, reminders of all that had been lost, and all that was yet to be forged. Steel became more than material. It became a prayer for strength, a symbol that something solid could emerge from so much ruin. Even in their weariness, the people carried a quiet patience, the kind born not of hope alone, but of endurance. The rhythm of rebuilding was soft and steady, a human heartbeat hidden beneath the clang of tools and the hum of foundries. And within that rhythm, something new began to form. Not yet a weapon, not yet an idea, but a quiet stirring of purpose that felt like the land itself awakening. In Kharkiv, behind locked factory doors and under dim bulbs, a group of engineers gathered in rooms lined with drafts and dreams. Their faces were drawn but alert, their eyes reflecting the pale blue of dawn against sheets of paper that trembled with potential. They spoke in low voices, cautious of every word, for the air of the 1930s carried both ambition and fear. Outside, posters urged loyalty and silence, yet inside, the hum of creation whispered differently. Their pencils glided over plans for engines and armor, for movement and endurance, for something that could cross both snow and mud without surrendering. They were young, though war and work had aged them faster than time. Each line they drew felt like defiance, not against a leader, but against the fragility that haunted their nation. They sought a kind of strength that could exist without cruelty, a machine that could protect rather than destroy. Around them, the smell of oil and graphite mixed with cold air, creating a strange sense of sanctuary. And as the night deepened, those whispered dreams took on a faint shimmer of inevitability, as though history itself was leaning in to listen. Beyond those walls, Europe was stirring uneasily, and the winds carried rumors of power and vengeance. In Berlin, speeches grew louder. In Warsaw, footsteps of soldiers echoed faintly across cobblestones. And in Moscow, the air tightened with the weight of decisions. The Soviet Union was still healing, yet it lived under the constant shadow of suspicion and control. People had learned that silence could be safety, that dreams should be small and hidden. But in the workshops and foundries, silence became creation instead of fear. Each bolt, each rivet, each heartbeat of the machines spoke of quiet defiance. For the workers, the act of building was an act of survival, and through that rhythm, faith returned, not faith in politics, but in endurance. The horizon seemed uncertain, but endurance was something they understood better than anyone. And so, without fanfare or permission, they continued to build, as though the future depended on their patience alone. Steel itself has a temperament, a mood that mirrors its makers. When it glows, it carries the warmth of promise. When it cools, it holds silence like memory. The men and women who shaped it knew its moods as if it were alive. They could feel when the metal was ready, when it was too cold, too brittle, or too proud. In their hands, strength was not harsh but patient, shaped through rhythm and breath. Sparks rose like tiny stars in the dim light of the factories, and the ringing of hammers became the song of rebirth. The workers did not think of war. They thought of safety, of families, of building something that might stand when everything else fell. Each strike of the hammer was a heartbeat of purpose, steady and human. Even exhaustion became holy, because it meant the dream was still alive. And somewhere between the glow of molten metal and the sigh of cooling steel, the first outlines of a new age began to take form. It was as if endurance itself had found a body. At night, the engineers stayed behind when the others went home, the lamps casting trembling halos of gold over their faces. They argued in whispers, the kind of soft arguments born not of pride but of obsession. They debated weight, speed and balance, their pencils darting over paper as if sketching prayers. One of them, Mikhail Koshkin, carried the fire of an artist inside the frame of an engineer. He believed that strength and grace could coexist, that a tank could move not as a brute, but as a dancer through mud and snow. His voice was gentle, his health failing, but his conviction unbroken. The others followed him, sensing in his quiet passion something greater than invention, perhaps even redemption. The nights were long and cold, yet filled with a strange peace, as though time itself paused to watch. And as dawn crept through the frost-covered windows, their papers shimmered faintly in the light. The dream, once only an idea, now had a shape, fragile, imperfect, and utterly alive. Rumors began to drift through nearby towns of something being built in secret. No one knew what it was, only that it was made for defense, not conquest. Workers in distant regions heard that new machines were being assembled from parts that seemed almost mythical. They did not ask questions, for curiosity was dangerous, but in their silence they felt pride. Each rivet tightened, each beam lifted, became a word in an unspoken promise. The hum of the foundries filled the night like a lullaby for the anxious. Hope, though unspoken, began to move through the land like wind through long grass. It touched even the weary, even the doubtful, reminding them that protection could be crafted by human hands. The sound of progress was quiet, but it carried farther than anyone could have imagined, and in the stillness between each heartbeat of the factories, the line between dream and reality grew faint, as if steel were already learning to breathe. Winter came again, slow and heavy, cloaking everything in a hush that felt both ancient and new. The Ural Mountains watched from afar, their peaks dusted in silence. In the valleys below, the sound of hammers echoed like distant thunder, though no storms came. Villagers heard it and wondered what was being born out there in the cold. Even the rivers, half frozen and silver under moonlight, seemed to hum with expectation. In the hidden factories, the first armor plates cooled under watchful eyes, their surfaces gleaming like mirrors of the future. Each plate carried fingerprints of the unknown, marks of hands that believed without seeing. The engineers tested, adjusted and persisted, their work both endless and sacred. They did not know that history was already turning toward them. And yet, deep within the silence of winter, the sound of creation continued, quiet as breath, certain as destiny. The year turned softly, and with it came the uneasy scent of change. War was no longer a rumor. It was a shadow growing at the edges of every conversation. People spoke of alliances, of armies, of power, but the workers only listened to the hum of their machines, steady as ever. Koshkin, pale from exhaustion, looked at the completed blueprints and felt both triumph and sorrow. He knew that beauty, when built for survival, would never stay untouched. Yet he also knew that what they had made was more than metal. It was endurance given form. Outside, snow covered the land like a page waiting to be written upon. The first light of morning touched the edges of the steel, and for a moment the cold seemed to shine with warmth. Somewhere far beyond the horizon, storms were gathering, but for now, under the calm sky of the Urals, the idea had found its voice. As the sun rose over the Ural Mountains, the first sparks of an idea began to glow, the dream of a tank that could outlast fear itself. In the quiet heart of Kharkiv, the morning light filtered through narrow windows onto rows of worn drafting tables. Dust drifted lazily in the air, catching the glow like tiny fragments of forgotten time. The factory complex outside was already awake, its hum rising in steady rhythm. Yet within these design rooms, another kind of music played, the sound of pencils, compasses, and careful breathing. Mikhail Koshkin sat near the center, his back slightly bent, tracing lines that curved not just toward function, but toward something deeply human. Around him, young engineers whispered ideas, afraid their enthusiasm might be mistaken for recklessness. Every sound seemed to echo too loudly, for in these times even ideas could be overheard. The walls were thick, the doors always closed, and the air carried both promise and caution. What they were designing was not merely a machine, but a philosophy, a way of surviving through movement, not might. Steel and soil, man and endurance, each would depend on the other. And through those long hours of concentration, the room itself began to feel like a living mind, thinking, breathing, and believing. Within that quiet, the first outlines of genius began to stir. Koshkin was not alone in his pursuit. Alongside him worked a younger engineer, Alexander Morozov, whose calm precision balanced Koshkin's restless vision. Morozov rarely spoke at length, but his hands communicated in gestures that seemed to solve problems before words could form. Together they imagined a machine that could cross rivers and climb hills where others faltered. They knew that protection was not enough. A tank must move like wind, its strength measured not by its armor alone, but by its agility. Every test they ran, every line adjusted, was an act of faith against the weight of tradition. Many said their goals were impossible. Thick armor meant slowness, speed meant vulnerability. But Koshkin and Morozov saw no contradiction. They saw balance waiting to be found, a harmony of steel and motion. Around them the sound of rulers tapping wood and paper rustling created a rhythm that felt like the heartbeat of progress. The light shifted on their desks as hours passed, turning sketches into small prayers for a safer tomorrow. In that shared rhythm, invention became a language of quiet courage. The world outside their walls was uneasy, though few spoke of it aloud. Reports from beyond the borders spoke of armies swelling and factories roaring to life in Germany. Within the Soviet Union, the purges still lingered like ghosts. Names whispered, doors knocked upon at night, voices vanishing into the cold. The engineers knew what it meant to work under eyes that never blinked. Each mistake could mean not just failure, but disappearance. And yet they continued, drawn forward by necessity stronger than fear. Koshkin often said that ideas could survive where men could not, and that thought comforted them more than any speech could. The sketches on their tables grew in number, curling at the edges like old leaves. Between exhaustion and quiet determination, something deeper formed, a belief that even under watchful silence truth could still take shape. The war was coming, though none yet dared to name it. And so, beneath the veil of caution, creation became their form of resistance. They worked through days that stretched into one another without clear beginning or end. Meals were taken standing, words were few, and each pencil seemed to wear down faster than the last. Sometimes Koshkin would pause and close his eyes, as if listening to something beyond the walls, the faint hum of destiny, perhaps, or the distant promise of use. Morozov would adjust the angles of his ruler, refining what the elder dreamt. Together they built in thought what they could not yet build in steel. The concept was simple yet revolutionary, a tank light enough to move swiftly, armored enough to survive, and armed enough to strike without pause. Every calculation they made carried both hope and danger, for each advancement would demand proof before skeptical eyes. Their prototypes would have to speak for them, louder and truer than any explanation could. The air grew thick with the scent of ink and oil, and the ticking of the clock felt like the pulse of an unseen race. In the stillness between those ticks, the impossible began to feel inevitable. Sometimes when the weight of secrecy grew too heavy, Koshkin walked outside the design room into the open courtyard of the factory. There the air was cold and smelled faintly of snow and metal. He would stand beneath the faint glow of lamps and let the silence stretch, thinking of the thousands of workers who would one day touch what he imagined. He knew that no creation truly belonged to its maker. Once complete, it would belong to the people who used it, to the land that demanded it. The snow fell softly on his shoulders, and he would close his eyes, letting the flakes melt against the heat of his skin. In those moments, the weight of responsibility felt both unbearable and sacred. Behind him, Morozov and the others continued to work, their quiet energy flowing like a current through the walls. Koshkin would return, brush the snow from his coat, and pick up his pencil again. The lines he drew were never straight. They bent slightly, as if acknowledging the unevenness of the world. Each curve was a small act of understanding, a gesture of mercy drawn in graphite. And with every curve, the dream moved closer to being real. Weeks turned to months, and the sketches gave birth to models. The models to small-scale forms of steel. They tested them in frozen courtyards and muddy fields, sometimes at dawn, when no one would notice. The early trials were humble, full of noise and imperfection, yet within each failure lay a hint of triumph. The engineers learnt to listen to the machines as if they spoke in tones of vibration and heat. Every groan of metal, every stubborn gear, became a lesson in patience. They were not building beauty. They were building endurance disguised as grace. Morozov kept notes on every adjustment, his handwriting neat and unwavering, even as his hands trembled from fatigue. Koshkin watched, rarely smiling, but when a test succeeded, his silence grew lighter, as though a shadow had lifted. The machines were clumsy still, but their movement carried intention, a kind of willfulness that mirrored their makers. And in that rough, halting motion, something remarkable began to emerge. The idea had found its feet, and it was learning to walk. Beyond Kharkiv, the land prepared itself without knowing why. Farmers plowed fields, unaware that one day those same fields would bear witness to thunder, not of weather, but of war. The skies over Europe were darkening, and yet in these workshops there was only the steady glow of purpose. Letters came from Moscow, requesting progress reports written with perfect obedience. The engineers replied carefully, hiding vision behind modesty. A new medium tank, they called it. Nothing more, nothing less. But beneath that phrase lay a revolution in thought, mobility and protection, strength without arrogance, power without excess. Koshkin often wondered whether those in power would ever understand the heart of what they were building. It was not a monument to force, but a vessel for endurance, and in that belief lay the quiet dignity that guided every sleepless night. Their secret was simple. They were not building for glory, but for survival. As spring arrived, the test grounds thawed, and the prototype's tracks pressed the wet soil with hesitant determination. The engineers stood at a distance, watching it move, its engine coughing, then steadying, its hull glinting faintly under the pale sun. It was not perfect, but it was alive, and that was enough. Around them, the air carried both relief and awe, as if something unseen had exhaled. For months, they had built in silence. Now silence rewarded them with motion. Koshkin smiled faintly. One of the rare times his expression softened into peace. Morozov placed a hand on the metal surface, feeling the faint vibration travel up his arm like a heartbeat. The dream that began as pencil lines had become sound and weight. What they had built was not yet ready for war, but it had already conquered fear. And as the light deepened toward evening, they gathered their tools, their hearts quietly full of wonder. They drew lines on paper, not knowing those lines would redraw the fate of a continent. Winter in Moscow had a weight of its own, not just in snow, but in silence. The streets were swept clean each morning, yet footsteps vanished too quickly, as though the city itself wanted to forget who passed through it. Newspapers spoke of progress, of 5-year plans fulfilled ahead of time, of factories glowing with purpose. But beneath the headlines, another story drifted quietly from door to door, names whispered, files sealed, voices erased. In ministries and offices, chairs sat empty, the morning after their occupants were summoned. Some were taken for words spoken without care, others for words never spoken at all. In this climate, invention became both salvation and risk, a light held too brightly in the dark. The engineers in Kharkiv knew these patterns well, for even genius could be interpreted as defiance. Koshkin and Morozov worked with care not only in design, but in speech, weighing each word as though it were made of glass. Outside, the snow fell in perfect silence, as if covering what could not be remembered. And through that silence the sound of industry carried like a quiet heartbeat beneath fear. Inside the factories, the rhythm of hammers and engines offered strange comfort. The clang of steel was predictable. Unlike the sudden knocks that came at night, men learned to listen not for music, but for absence. The silence between footsteps, the breath held too long, the door left slightly ajar. Koshkin's team worked late, often until the lamps flickered low and shadows merged into one another. Each of them carried their own small doubts, but none dared voice them. To question meant to expose, and to expose was to vanish. The drawings they made by day were gathered carefully at night, folded into locked drawers like prayers meant to survive inspection. Sometimes a designer who had shared their tea one evening would be gone by dawn, his tools left in quiet order on the table, yet the work continued, because to stop was to invite suspicion, and to continue was to remain unseen within motion. Their devotion to the machine became a refuge, a steady current in a river of unease. And in that current survival became an act of devotion disguised as labor. Letters from Moscow came stamped with red ink, and written in language that was both commanding and uncertain. Approvals arrived beside denials, praise beside warnings, as if the state itself could not decide whether to fear or protect those who dreamed too far ahead. Koshkin read them carefully, tracing each line with slow fingers, listening for meaning between the words. He knew that innovation often looked like rebellion when seen through the wrong eyes. Still, he chose to move forward, not through defiance, but through quiet persistence. Each report he wrote was wrapped in humility, the tone deferential, the ambition hidden behind phrases of obedience. His gift was not only in design but in disguise, the art of making revolution appear as routine. Morozov admired this skill but worried it could not last forever, for truth has a way of shining through even when carefully dimmed. And so, beneath the language of bureaucracy, two men continued to dream of steel that could protect more than it could destroy. The paper trail they left behind was thin, yet the faith that guided them was vast. Beneath every cautious signature, the pulse of belief continued to beat. Beyond the design rooms, the countryside trembled with its own quiet transformations. Collectivized farms worked through snow and hunger, their machines few, their spirits worn but not extinguished. Families moved to cities, chasing the promise of steady work, unaware of how easily the city could swallow them whole. Factories expanded like small kingdoms, their chimneys stretching toward the grey heavens in silent competition. The people toiled not for themselves, but for an idea, vast, abstract, and spoken only in slogans. Yet in the midst of this machinery of survival, small kindness endured, a shared loaf of bread, a song hummed softly at the end of a shift, a moment of warmth by a furnace. These gestures, though fleeting, were acts of quiet rebellion against despair. The T-34's story was born in such a world, not from triumph, but from necessity softened by human endurance. Each worker who polished steel, or turned a bolt, carried more than a task. They carried hope disguised as duty, and in their patience the future was being welded together, one silent spark at a time. Through their silence, something stronger than fear began to take shape. Rumors moved faster than truth in those years, carried on the same air that froze the breath of those who spoke them. Some said the secret police visited Kharkiv, others that certain engineers were questioned and released, though no one could confirm what release truly meant. In this haze of uncertainty, trust became rare, and friendship became a risk. Yet Koshkin persisted in his gentleness, encouraging his team to think freely, to imagine without speaking too loudly. His calm became a kind of shelter, a warmth that kept them anchored to something human. Morozov often wondered how long that calm could endure. Surrounded by so much invisible peril, every conversation felt like a negotiation between honesty and survival. Even laughter was cautious, a sound quickly swallowed by the echoing halls. Still, the work did not stop, for the mind could not be arrested while it was in motion, and through this quiet defiance, the blueprints continued to multiply like petals of a steel flower unfolding in secret. Within that hidden bloom, the seed of the T-34 gathered its first strength. In meetings with officials, Koshkin chose his words with the delicacy of a craftsman handling fine glass. He spoke of efficiency, of standardization, of meeting quotas, phrases that satisfied those who listened for loyalty rather than vision. Yet beneath his tone lived another message, one that only the attentive could hear, that innovation itself was an act of faith in the future. When asked if his tank could match foreign designs, he answered simply that it would serve the motherland in ways not yet imagined. The answer was vague enough to survive scrutiny, yet precise enough to inspire quiet confidence. He knew that language could build walls or open doors, depending on how it was used. Around him, others stumbled over words that betrayed emotion. He did not. His restraint was his armor, his sincerity the hidden engine beneath it. Every day that passed without summons felt like a small victory over the invisible tide, and through his caution, his dream survived where others had been silenced. His restraint became the vessel through which invention stayed alive. By 1938, the Soviet Union stood poised between fear and ambition. Stalin's voice still echoed across the airwaves, promising unity and strength. Yet even the faithful had begun to sense the weight beneath the words. Military observers whispered of foreign tanks across the western borders, machines faster, stronger, more confident. The Red Army, though vast, knew its armor was old and its doctrine uncertain. The call for renewal grew louder, but those who answered it risked being mistaken for critics. Koshkin saw in this moment not danger, but necessity. His vision was no longer a proposal. It was a quiet answer to a question the state was too proud to ask aloud. He believed that if the design could live long enough to prove itself, it would outlast the politics that surrounded it. And so, under the hum of fluorescent light and the constant gaze of portraits on the wall, his team pressed forward. Each stroke of pencil now carried the weight of both invention and survival. The nation trembled, and the machine that might steady it waited in the shadows. As spring thawed the last of winter's ice, Kharkiv's skies lightened, though the air still carried a chill of uncertainty. Kolskin stood by the workshop window, watching the workers arrive, their coats dark with morning frost. He wondered how many of them understood the scale of what they were building, how many believed that their hands shaped more than metal. Around him the room filled with the quiet confidence of routine, the sound of progress wrapped in fear. Morozov handed him a set of new calculations, numbers that promised strength without sacrifice. The design was nearing completion, yet the risk of exposure grew heavier with each passing day. They knew that soon their work would leave the safety of secrecy and face judgment beyond their control. But for that moment the world seemed to pause, suspended between danger and possibility. Outside, a thin wind moved through the factory yard, carrying the faint scent of steel and snow. In a land where silence was safety, even courage had to whisper. In the stillness of early 1939, Kharkiv's factory yard stirred before dawn. Frost clung to the rails, and the breath of the workers lingered in the cold air like pale smoke. For months they had built in secrecy, bolts turned by tired hands, blueprints read beneath dim lamps. Now before them stood a shape that did not yet have a name that history would remember, only a number scrawled in grease pencil, A32. Its armor, dull grey and unpainted, caught the first hint of sunrise, as if the light itself were curious. Koshkin stood a few steps back, his gloved hands still, his expression unreadable. He had imagined this moment countless times, yet its reality felt almost too fragile to touch. Around him the team waited in reverent silence, their fatigue softened by awe. The machine seemed alive in its stillness, a creature half-dreamed, half-forged. Beneath its steel hull, the earth waited for the weight of a new kind of promise. The dawn was cold, but in that stillness, a quiet warmth began to rise. The first ignition came hesitantly, a low cough that rippled through the men gathered nearby. Then a deeper growl followed, uneven, uncertain, but unmistakably alive. Diesel smoke curled into the morning air, carrying with it the scent of oil and anticipation. The engineers leaned in, their faces glowing with the reflection of motion. The A-32 began to move, treads pressing into frozen soil with slow, deliberate strength. Each rotation of its wheels was a declaration. The idea had become real. It was not graceful, not yet. The movement was heavy, hesitant, like a child learning to walk. But beneath the imperfections there was rhythm, a balance between power and purpose. The noise filled the air like a long-awaited voice, harsh yet strangely musical. For the first time, invention had taken breath and form, and in that steady rhythm, the first song of steel began to play. Koshkin walked beside the moving tank, his boots crunching softly on the frozen ground. He could feel the vibration in his chest, as though the earth itself were responding to the machine's weight. The workers followed at a respectful distance, afraid to speak, unwilling to break the fragile magic of the moment. Every clank, every hiss of pressure was both a test and a prayer. The tank turned slowly, its treads biting into the earth, flinging loose frost aside. Steam rose from its exhaust, catching the light like silver mist. To an outsider it might have looked crude, but to those who had built it, it was beautiful in its imperfection. Each scratch and rivet carried the memory of sleepless nights, of whispered plans, of silent fears conquered by persistence. Koshkin placed his hand gently on the armor. It was warm now, vibrating with life. The dream that had survived suspicion and silence had finally moved beneath an open sky. And through that warmth, every risk once taken began to feel like faith rewarded. Yet even in triumph there were doubts. The gears groaned under strain, the suspension fought against the uneven ground, and leaks appeared where metal met metal too tightly. The engine coughed again, protesting the cold, and for a moment it seemed the great machine might surrender. But Morozov smiled. Such flaws were expected, even welcome. They were signs that something alive could still grow stronger. He scribbled notes in his small book, his handwriting steady, his eyes shining with quiet pride. Around him, mechanics moved with cautious efficiency, their breath fogging the air as they adjusted valves and tightened bolts. They worked not with frustration, but with patience, for perfection was never born without imperfection first. The machine quieted again, resting as though it too were learning to breathe more deeply. It had survived its first awakening, and that was enough for now. Even in its stumbles, the machine had proven its will to endure. Later that day, as the sun began to soften the frost, the prototype moved beyond the factory gates. It rolled slowly down a dirt track that led toward the open fields beyond Kharkiv. Villagers paused in their paths, watching in wonder as the unfamiliar sound reached their ears. Some removed their hats, uncertain whether to fear or admire what they saw. The tank's steel glinted faintly under the pale light, a moving mirror of human determination. Koshkin followed on foot again, Refusing to ride inside, he wanted to feel the earth move with it, to measure its strength, not by numbers but by trust. Each mile revealed new flaws, but also new possibilities. The treads bit deeper, found their rhythm, found their balance. For the first time, the land itself seemed to listen. The boundaries between machine and soil blurred into something older, something instinctive. And when steel first kissed soil, the earth itself seemed to tremble, as if history had heard its cue. That evening, the factory yard returned to silence, but it was a different silence than before. It carried memory now, the echo of movement, the hum of creation fulfilled. Workers lingered longer than usual, reluctant to leave the place where they had witnessed possibility made real. Some spoke softly, recalling the first sound of the engine, comparing it to thunder, to a hymn, to the beating of a distant drum. For many, it was the first time in years that pride did not feel dangerous. The idea that something born from their hands could one day protect the very soil they stood on filled them with quiet strength. Morozov wiped his hands clean of grease, his expression thoughtful, already imagining what would come next. Koshkin, standing alone near the resting tank, whispered something no one else could hear, a promise, perhaps, or a prayer. Above them, a faint wind moved through the chimneys, carrying the scent of diesel and snow. The day ended, but the sound of progress lingered like an afterthought in the dusk. That night, in his small apartment, Koshkin could not sleep. The city outside was quiet, but his mind was filled with motion, the steady rhythm of treads, the deep breath of the engine. He replayed every moment of the trial, every hesitation, every success. He thought of the risks still ahead, the approvals yet to come, the eyes in Moscow that might look upon his creation with envy or suspicion. But beneath all that worry was peace, a rare and fragile calm. The machine had moved, and that was all that mattered for now. He poured himself a cup of weak tea and watched the steam rise into the dim light. In that silence, he could almost hear the hum of the workshop again, the murmur of men working toward something greater than themselves. He smiled softly, tired but content. Outside, the night stretched endlessly, and for once it did not feel threatening. And through that long night, the dream rolled onward, steady and sure. The next morning, frost returned to the earth, sealing the tracks left behind by the day before. To most, they were just marks in the soil, soon to be covered again by wind and time. But for those who had seen it move, those tracks meant something else. A beginning, a sign that even under pressure, hope could leave its mark. In the years to come, the world would remember the T-34, not for how it began, but for what it became. Yet in this quiet moment before recognition, before war, before legend, it was simply a machine learning to exist. Koshkin knew that ahead lay challenges far greater than faulty engines or frozen valves. But he also knew that once a dream moves, it cannot be unmade. The tank rested silently now, as if gathering strength for what awaited it. Its creators too felt the pause, a deep breath between uncertainty and destiny. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the wind began to change, carrying with it the faint scent of coming storms. September arrived quietly, yet with a weight no one could ignore. Across the western borders of Europe, the first tremors of war shifted the horizon. News traveled slowly, carried by radio and telegram, each word more alarming than the last. In Kharkiv, the engineers read with muted anxiety, their hands resting on blueprints they had touched for months. Morozov traced a line on a sketch, imagining its purpose in ways he dared not speak aloud. Outside, the trees whispered in the wind, their branches like fingers pointing toward uncertainty. The factory hummed as usual, but each footstep and hammer strike carried a different sound now, a quiet reminder that the world had changed. Koshkin lingered by a window, watching the smoke rise from distant chimneys, wondering if tomorrow's dawn would be the same. Even the frost on the ground seemed sharper, harder, as if the earth itself understood the coming trials. And so they worked with careful hands, their silence a shield against the storm approaching. The horizon stretched with tension, waiting for the first ripple of movement to arrive. In the days that followed, reports confirmed the invasion of Poland. The news arrived in measured tones, but the meaning was clear. War had begun, uninvited and relentless. Engineers spoke little, though their minds raced, imagining maps and borders shifting like sand. Koshkin and Morozov understood that their work could no longer remain an experiment confined to frost-laden yards. The T-34, still imperfect, was close to being more than paper and steel. Its purpose would soon be tested, not by calculation, but by necessity. The whispers of the factory carried tension like a current, brushing against every ear. Outside, the wind carried distant echoes of movement, the faint hint of trains loaded with men and machines heading west. The weight of history pressed gently on the shoulders of those who had dared to dream. Even as anxiety hummed beneath every conversation, a strange calm held the room together, a quiet faith that careful preparation could meet sudden storms. And within that faith, the first tremors of destiny began to stir. The engineers gathered in the evenings, speaking softly of possibilities rather than certainties. They imagined scenarios where speed mattered more than strength, or where armor would fail unless carefully placed. Each discussion circled around questions without answers, the kind that weighed heavily in quiet hearts. Morozov sketched diagrams in the margins of notes that would never leave the room. Koshkin often leaned back, hands clasped, listening to the distant rumble of trains or the muted hum of factories. The world was shifting, yet their creation remained an anchor in uncertainty. The T-34 was more than metal. It was a repository of hope and endurance. Outside, shadows lengthened across frozen grounds, and the fading sun painted everything in muted gold. Even the soft whistle of wind seemed charged with forewarning. In those shared silences, they felt the quiet pulse of a future not yet born, waiting to rise. And as Europe trembled, their creation prepared to awaken. Rumors from the Western Front filtered into the factory, whispered through channels that avoided direct mention of death. Cities burned, borders shifted, and yet no vivid images arrived, only the quiet intensity of loss, conveyed in tone and cadence rather than detail. Koshkin and Morozov listened, absorbing the gravity without allowing it to paralyze them. They understood that the T-34 must exist not for pride but for survival. In their hands, calculations became prayers, adjustments became meditations. They spoke little of the future, focusing instead on the present task, ensuring that movement, armor, and endurance could coexist. Each test of the prototype felt heavier now, imbued with the knowledge that real use would come sooner than expected. The tank's tracks left patterns in mud and snow that seemed to echo unseen marches. Even as fear circled the edges of their consciousness, their focus sharpened, quiet and deliberate. The hum of diesel and the creak of treads became a lullaby for courage, soft yet insistent. And through this lullaby, resolve took root, steady and unshakable. At the edge of the factory grounds, the T-34 ran again across frost-bitten fields. The earth trembled beneath the steel, not from weight alone, but from the intent within it. Koshkin followed at a distance, hands in pockets, listening to the rhythm of treads over stone and soil. Morozov noted minor hesitations in the engine, minor shifts in balance, recording each quietly without alarm. The prototype moved imperfectly, but with purpose, like a heartbeat finding its cadence. Wind whispered through the skeletal trees, carrying faint scents of frost and oil. The engineers felt the hum of creation as though it were a companion, alive in its clumsiness. Each successful turn brought a muted joy, a quiet celebration of survival through craft. They understood, as they always had, that the machine was a promise not yet fulfilled. And with every rotation of the wheels, Europe's distant fire became a distant echo, felt but unaddressed. The world was on the brink, and the tank began to learn its own strength. That evening, a rare letter arrived from Moscow, praising progress but hinting at urgency. Koshkin read it aloud, voice low, feeling the weight of every carefully chosen word. The letter implied expectation without explicit instruction, a subtle pressure that was more binding than direct command. Morozov remained silent, absorbing the tension while imagining what might come in weeks, months, or days. Outside, snow softened the edges of the factory, but inside, anticipation sharpened every thought. The engineers prepared for trials, knowing their work could soon face reality in a form more severe than frost or imbalance. They gathered tools, lubricants, and spare parts, rehearsing in whispers the motions that would preserve the prototype. In this preparation, they found calm, a meditation of motion and readiness. Each movement of the tank over uneven ground became an echo of what might be demanded beyond their walls. And in the quiet of preparation, the T-34 seemed to pulse with its own life, ready to answer the summons it could not yet hear. The heartbeat of steel quickened, synchronized with the distant drum of conflict. On the horizon, smoke from the western borders reached faintly, a muted signal of human urgency and destruction. The engineers watched in quiet awe, imagining the lands where the sound of marching men filled the air. The T-34 rested now, silent and patient, as if listening to the winds that carried distant fire. Koshkin traced his fingers over the hull, remembering every night spent designing curves and edges that could endure both frost and peril. Morozov adjusted the suspension one last time, a subtle gesture of care and faith. Even the faintest breeze seemed to honor the moment, brushing over metal and frost with reverent touch. The city beyond remained still, yet in imagination, battles moved with swift, shadowed steps. In the quiet they realized that the tank had moved from dream to presence, a vessel waiting for the moment it would prove itself. And as stars began to pierce the deepening night, the engineers understood that their creation had grown larger than the fears that had shaped it. War had begun, and the T-34 was no longer a dream, but a heartbeat waiting to be summoned. Winter arrived with a quiet insistence, blanketing fields and forests in layers of frost and snow. The air was crisp, sharp enough to wake senses dulled by months of labor, and the ground glittered like scattered crystal. The T-34 moved slowly through this frozen world, each tread sinking gently into snow that resisted yet yielded. Koshkin and Morozov followed on foot, their breaths visible in the cold, watching the machine negotiate ice and drifted snow. Each movement was deliberate, cautious, yet persistent, a dialogue between steel and nature. Frost crept along edges of metal, yet it did not hinder, it highlighted resilience, making the tank's purpose tangible in ways blueprints never could. The engineers noted the hum of gears against silence, a soft counterpoint to wind sweeping through skeletal branches. Even the distant caw of crows felt like punctuation in the calm symphony of trial. Every turn of the wheels became a lesson in patience, every slip a subtle teacher. Through the quiet, cold endurance whispered its own story, one that did not demand attention, only observation. And in that whisper, The first truth of winter revealed itself. The forest stretched endlessly, white and still, the weight of snow bending the boughs into arches over the path. The T-34 pressed forward, its engine a muted growl against the hush of frozen air. Morozov trailed close, jotting notes on balance and pressure, capturing the way metal responded to frost-hardened earth. Koshkin crouched near the edge of a frozen creek, listening as the machine's treads pressed rhythmically against ice and soil. Occasionally, the vehicle faltered slightly, a hesitation that revealed both fragility and adaptability. Each correction by the engineers was gentle, deliberate, as if coaxing life from something living rather than controlling a machine. Snow dusted the shoulders of the crew and the tank alike, softening edges, blurring distinctions. The silence carried weight, yet it was neither oppressive nor empty. It was reflective, a companion to motion. Time seemed to stretch, seconds elongating in crisp clarity, each measured and meaningful. And in that expanse of white, every movement felt like proof of quiet endurance. The forest did not judge, but it taught with patience that few could match. Frost crept inside small crevices of the engine, yet the T-34 continued, its mechanics singing a subtle, persistent rhythm. Koshkin wiped his gloves on his coat, feeling the vibration of the steel beneath him. He had imagined this moment countless times, but reality was more delicate than theory. Morozov adjusted a valve gently, whispering instructions as if the tank might listen. Each adjustment made the machine more certain, its motion more confident. The snow under its tracks pressed and released in a soft cadence, creating a slow drumbeat that accompanied their progress. In this interplay of cold and metal, a strange intimacy formed between human and machine. Even the distant horizon, pale under the winter sun, seemed to watch silently, acknowledging endurance in motion. Small puffs of steam from the exhaust painted transient clouds that drifted lazily through trees. The T-34 moved without hurry, but with quiet determination, learning the rhythm of winter as if it were part of its own design. And in that rhythm, the engineers sensed a promise that exceeded calculation. By midday, the sun lowered toward a horizon veiled in silver haze. Shadows stretched across snowdrifts, long and soft brushing edges of the machine with gentle light. The tank climbed a slight rise, its tracks biting into frost-locked soil, leaving a pattern of measured persistence. Koshkin paused, hands on knees, feeling the vibration through his legs, noting how the treads responded to weight and angle. Morozov crouched beside a wheel, checking pressure, noting the subtle give beneath steel and snow. Birds occasionally moved above, wings stirring soft gusts of cold air that whispered through the forest. The tank creaked softly at points, reminders that endurance was not effortless, but earned. The engineers observed these minor protests, without frustration, finding reassurance in the lesson they contained. Each small correction allowed motion to resume, continuous yet patient, and as sunlight shifted, silvering frost-tipped branches, they felt the quiet approval of a land that had tested them gently but thoroughly. Nature had not resisted. It had revealed the capacity to endure. As afternoon waned, Koshkin reflected on the months of planning and risk that had brought them here. The world beyond the forest moved toward chaos, yet within this white stillness, time slowed, measured only by breath, treads, and thought. Every hesitation of the machine offered insight, a note in a soft symphony of interaction. Morozov's gloved hands traced lines of frost along the hull, imagining adjustments that would carry the T-34 through colder winters and rougher fields. The forest floor yielded beneath tracks in a muted crunch, echoing softly, harmonizing with the growl of the engine. A quiet wind shifted snow into gentle drifts, brushing across metal and leather alike, brushing away dust of past labor, revealing the clarity of survival. Each moment reinforced the tank's purpose, not dominance but endurance. Even as the shadows lengthened, a calm sense of accomplishment settled over the engineers. They recognized that this machine, imperfect as it still was learning, adapting, becoming more than a collection of parts. In the hush of winter, the T-34 had found its voice. And that voice carried the quiet confidence of resilience. By late afternoon, the tank rested at the edge of a frozen meadow, the sun pale on the horizon. Frost glittered on rivets and seams, a soft crown for their labor. Koshkin leaned against its hull, feeling warmth from the engine's slow cooling seep through the metal, subtle and satisfying. Morozov traced notes in a worn notebook, fingers numb but steady, capturing patterns that only snow and treads could reveal. The silence was not absence, it was reflection, a soft mirror of what had been achieved. Even distant noises, a bird's call, a snapping branch, became part of the rhythm, integrated into observation and understanding. They spoke little, trusting that motion and measurement would communicate better than words. The forest seemed to exhale with them, releasing the tension that had accumulated through months of anticipation. The T-34 stood quietly, waiting for its next trial, its form no longer uncertain but assured. And in that stillness, endurance felt absolute, a quiet companion to human resolve. The lesson of frost and soil had been learned, and it was steady and patient. Night fell slowly, and the engineers began the long walk back through the silent forest. The snow reflected the faint glow of a crescent moon, softening each footprint as though erasing the journey, yet leaving memory behind. Koshkin paused at intervals, listening to the gentle hum of the cooling engine and the whisper of wind through bare branches. Morozov's breath made clouds in the crisp night, each exhale a quiet acknowledgement of survival. Stars appeared above, pale and unwavering, as if observing the persistence below. The world beyond remained uncertain, but within this pocket of frost and quiet, something enduring had been affirmed. Each step home was measured, deliberate, a reflection of the patience the T-34 had taught them. They moved as though carrying not just blueprints and tools, but a confidence born of experience and quiet triumph. In the hush of winter night, they sensed the tank's readiness, its endurance tested and validated, and through the darkness, hope persisted, steady as the frozen earth beneath their feet. In the silence of winter, they found not defeat, but endurance. June dawned with a strange clarity, the sun rising over forests and plains that were poised on the edge of chaos. Koshkin and Morozov listened to distant reports, voices muffled over radio waves, speaking of borders crossed and defenses breached. The Red Army, vast but caught unprepared, retreated in a rhythm both desperate and uneven. Smoke rose from villages and factories, diffused by haze into soft tendrils that curled against the horizon. Amid this turmoil, the T-34 rolled from assembly lines, its steel hull catching light that glinted off frost and dust. Men who had worked quietly for months now witnessed their creation enter a world in motion, a sudden presence in the echo of uncertainty. The machine moved not with arrogance, but with persistence, each tread pressing firmly into the softened earth. Soldiers nearby paused, sensing the difference, a quiet awe beneath the hum of panic. The tank's form, simple yet strong, became a signal that resistance could exist, even when hope seemed scarce. And in that presence, the engineers felt the strange calm of inevitability, something built patiently now acting decisively. Across the horizon, the first tracks of defiance began to etch themselves. The T-34 advanced along roads softened by spring thaw, its engine a steady hum that contrasted the clamor of retreating units. Morozov followed in a small truck, noting the smoothness of its movement over uneven ground. Even as chaos stretched outward, the machine maintained balance, absorbing shocks and shifts, as if anticipating the terrain. Soldiers glanced, their expressions caught between disbelief and relief, recognizing that this was no ordinary armor. Koshkin felt the vibration through his boots, a tactile proof that months of care had become substance. The sunlight glinted along the turret, softening what might otherwise seem imposing. Around them, the wind carried faint scents of damp earth and wood smoke, reminders of a land under pressure yet still enduring. Every rotation of the tracks spoke of patience translated into action, of calculation becoming instinct. And as the tank moved steadily, the vast field seemed to breathe around it, acknowledging an arrival both quiet and resolute. It moved not as a conqueror, but as a presence grounded in purpose. By midday, small units of the Red Army gathered around, watching as the T-34 demonstrated its agility and persistence. Orders were whispered along lines of men, unsure of what to expect. The engineers observed the faces around them, catching brief flashes of recognition, awe mingled with uncertainty. Morozov noted how the tank could handle mud, snow remnants, and uneven roads without faltering. Koshkin imagined the countless adjustments and calculations that had led to this moment, each valve and spring a testament to patient care. The air carried a faint warmth, softening the tension that hung in the morning mist. Even distant birds seemed still, as though giving their silent approval. The soldiers who approached did so cautiously, yet their steps carried the lightness of hope. Every test of the machine now became a lesson, not just in mechanics, but in the quiet endurance of will. And as the T-34 continued forward, the field seemed to listen, responding with a muted acknowledgement of resilience. In that muted response, the engineers sensed their work had transcended paper and steel. News of the first T-34 spread slowly along the lines, carried in whispers between units. The tanks appeared unexpectedly, moving with rhythm and steadiness that unsettled observers accustomed to retreat. Soldiers spoke softly, describing their form, their weight, their persistence, as if conveying a secret in plain language. Even commanders, distant and overwhelmed, acknowledged the impact without exaggeration, their voices calm yet tinged with recognition. The machine's movement was deliberate, never hurried, yet unyielding in its presence. Koshkin and Morozov watched, hearts quiet but alert, noticing small nuances, a track slipping slightly, a wheel adjusting to weight, an engine breathing steadily under strain. The air held a tension tempered by fascination, the sense that something elemental had entered the field. Every breath seemed to stretch longer, each second measured and meaningful, as though time itself had slowed to accommodate this arrival. The T-34 had become both proof and promise, a whisper of capability in a storm of uncertainty. And as evening approached, its silhouette remained, a quiet shadow moving across golden fields. The machine was no longer theory. It was a presence felt by those who watched. As night fell, the T-34 rested near a line of trees, its engine cooling slowly, casting soft metal reflections under the fading light. Soldiers lingered nearby, speaking in low tones, recounting the calm persistence of the machine. Even in rest it seemed purposeful, as if awaiting its next command, with quiet dignity. Koshkin and Morozov walked along its side, observing dents and scratches that told of careful use and careful endurance. They touched the cold steel, feeling the residue of movement, a subtle vibration that lingered in their palms. The wind carried faint scents of soil and smoke, merging the human and mechanical presence into one soft memory. The forest seemed still, patient, absorbing the echoes of motion and machinery. In these moments, they reflected on the months of work and risk that had led here, on how silence and caution had prepared them for this sudden emergence. Every detail of the tank now seemed meaningful, a history in miniature, shaped by hands and winter trials. And through this quiet observation, the T-34 became more than a machine. It was a symbol of will made manifest. Across the fields of tension, the presence lingered like a soft pulse in the night. Morning arrived slowly. Light filtered through thin clouds, casting muted shadows across roads and meadows. The T-34 moved again, this time accompanied by small infantry units learning to follow its rhythm. The engine hummed low, steady, blending with the soft murmur of wind and distant bird calls. Morozov noted its endurance, its ability to absorb uneven terrain without faltering, as the world seemed poised on a delicate edge. Koshkin felt an unusual calm watching soldiers align their steps with the machine's progress, a silent recognition of shared rhythm. Snow patches and frozen mud gave way to tracks that carried weight evenly, balancing force and finesse. Even the horizon seemed distant yet present, a constant reminder of uncertainty beyond their immediate control. The soldiers moved with soft footsteps, careful not to disrupt the harmony of motion established by the tank. Every mile traveled reinforced the quiet lesson that presence, persistence, and patience could coexist. And as the day progressed, the T-34 seemed less like steel and more like a pulse running through the land itself. In that pulse, the idea of will took tangible form, moving quietly yet unyielding. By late afternoon, columns of retreating units paused to observe the T-34 in motion. Even the distant haze of smoke and movement did not diminish its calm, deliberate progression. Soldiers whispered among themselves, noting the simplicity of its form and the subtlety of its strength. The tank moved without hurry, yet its persistence created a presence impossible to ignore. Koshkin and Morozov walked along the side, hands brushing against cooled metal, feeling the residue of purpose in every joint and seam. The wind carried faint scents of thawing earth and distant fires, blending tension with reflection. Even small birds seemed hesitant in their flight, as though acknowledging the weight of what passed beneath them. The engineers recorded minor observations, each a meditation on endurance, balance, and harmony between design and reality. Every inch traveled became both proof and promise, a quiet myth unfolding in real time. And across fields poised between fear and hope, the T-34 moved, not as a weapon, but as a will made visible. Its rhythm lingered in the mind, a heartbeat of resolve stretching toward the horizon. The morning light spread softly across the fields of the Western Front, brushing frost-kissed grass with pale gold. Among retreating units, whispers traveled along lines, voices low and uncertain, speaking of a machine that appeared and vanished like mist. The T-34 moved steadily, each tread pressing with confidence, yet leaving no haste in its wake. Soldiers who had faced the shock of invasion paused, noting the unfamiliar shape, the low hum of its engine, the deliberate rhythm of its progress. Koshkin and Morozov observed from a gentle distance, noting the calm power that arose from careful design and patient trials. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of smoke and earth, blending history with presence. Even distant birds seemed hesitant, circling above but not disturbing the quiet pulse of movement below. Each rotation of the tracks whispered resilience, a subtle promise that endurance could manifest in unexpected forms. The T-34's quiet motion became legend in whispers, a ghost story told among soldiers whose nerves demanded reassurance. And in this calm, even the panic of the world seemed to fold into reflection, measured and still. It moved like a shadow, present yet untouchable, leaving awe in its wake. German commanders, distant and observing, found themselves unsettled by reports carried in low tones across lines. Units described encounters with steel that was fast, responsive, and seemingly impervious to effort. The words reached them in fragments. It appears where none should be. It disappears before we can react. There was no fear shouted, only recognition, the quiet acknowledgement that something remarkable had emerged. Koshkin and Morozov listened to second-hand reports, imagining their creation moving across fields far from their eyes. The T-34, once a sketch and a prototype, had become an idea embodied, translating careful calculations into graceful persistence. Soldiers whispered its name, cautious, reverent, unsure whether to treat it as a tool, a symbol, or a ghost. Even the wind seemed to carry the story further, scattering it over distant trees and open roads. Movement and silence intertwined, shaping the tale of something that existed both tangibly and as rumor. And the engineers, though removed, sensed that the tank had entered a realm beyond ordinary expectation. Its presence became a quiet language that spoke across borders and battle lines. Fields and forests blurred past the T-34 as it moved with measured speed, treads gliding over mud, softened by spring thaw. Morozov noted the smoothness, the way suspension absorbed irregularities, translating pressure into calm stability. Koshkin observed the soldiers who followed, their expressions softened by relief, a quiet awe settling over them like morning mist. The machine seemed to negotiate space with an intelligence born of careful design, finding gaps and adjusting to obstacles without agitation. Shadows shifted across snow remnants and puddles, reflecting a low sun in silvery light. The quiet hum of the engine became a rhythm matched by footsteps and soft conversations, blending human and machine into a singular cadence. Even distant smoke from fires or small skirmishes seemed to bend around the T-34, acknowledging its presence without confrontation. Each maneuver, each pause carried subtle instruction to those who observed: calm movement, thoughtful persistence, measured power. Soldiers learned to anticipate its motions, feeling an unspoken connection to the machine's steady pulse, and through these lessons, a sense of wonder began to settle over all who witnessed it. It was fast, it was resilient, and it moved like wind through the trees. In villages touched by retreat, people spoke quietly of the tanks that appeared, and moved with uncanny certainty. Children pointed across snow-flecked streets. Adults whispered to one another, voices careful and low, noting the unusual shape and speed. The T-34 passed like a wraith over fields, leaving impressions that faded under wind and frost. Koshkin imagined these stories traveling beyond his knowledge, tales shaped by awe and cautious respect. The engineers felt the soft satisfaction of validation, tempered by the calm awareness that legend and reality were intertwined. Even the ground seemed to absorb the passage, snow settling into soft depressions that marked fleeting presence. Wind shifted over frozen rooftops, carrying whispers of metal that moved as though alive. Observation became reflection, and reflection became story, gentle yet persistent. The machine moved with quiet authority, its form simple but unmistakable, communicating its own message without noise or boast. And in the silence of these crossings, endurance became a lesson felt rather than spoken. It left tracks that disappeared into the earth, yet remained in the minds of those who saw. Throughout the day, reports from multiple units converged, speaking of encounters that were brief yet transformative. Soldiers described glimpses of the T-34, appearing just beyond hedgerows, across frozen streams, along soft slopes. The descriptions carried awe without exaggeration, measured in tones that hinted at disbelief and admiration. Koshkin and Morozov read these reports, imagining the precise moments, the treads pressing into frost, the engine humming low. Even distant clouds seemed to move in sympathy, casting shadows that emphasized form and presence. The machine navigated spaces where others might falter, responding to weight and terrain with a grace born of meticulous attention. Silence followed its passage, a calm aftermath that allowed observation and thought to flourish. Each note, each recorded impression shaped a quiet narrative of reliability and subtle power. Soldiers shared these accounts in murmurs, careful to respect both machine and mystery. And the T-34 continued to move, indifferent to applause or fear, embodying endurance in every soft rotation. Its reputation traveled faster than the machines themselves, carried on quiet lips and still minds. Evening brought muted light across fields, long shadows stretching along frost-lined roads. The T-34 paused briefly near a small rise, its engine cooling in a soft sigh. Soldiers approached carefully, feeling both respect and a sense of wonder at the quiet strength before them. Morozov took notes, his pen tracing lines over margins, recording subtle observations that would guide further production. Koshkin leaned on the tank, feeling residual warmth from its engine, a physical echo of motion translated into touch. Wind stirred over the fields, brushing snowflakes across steel and earth alike, softening impressions and edges. The presence of the machine seemed to calm the tension of the day, offering a quiet reassurance that persistence could endure even in chaos. Birds circled high, their distant calls folding into the hushed soundscape of movement and observation. The soldiers spoke little, sensing that silence allowed the story of endurance to settle. And under the dimming sky, the T-34 rested, poised for the next moment, a quiet emblem of unseen power. Even in repose, it carried the weight of respect and the promise of resilience. Night descended gently, stretching long shadows across frost and softened soil. Koshkin and Morozov lingered, listening to the faint hum of cooling metal, noting subtle vibrations that spoke of energy spent and preserved. Stars began to pierce the soft veil of darkness, indifferent observers to the quiet miracle below. Soldiers retreated to nearby huts and camps, murmuring tales of the machines that moved like ghosts across their paths. Wind whispered through skeletal trees, brushing over tracks left behind, erasing evidence but leaving memory intact. The engineers reflected on months of work, trials, and small triumphs that had culminated in this serene yet potent presence. The T-34, once a blueprint, now existed as a force both real and intangible, moving silently through the minds of those who witnessed it. Each breath of air carried faint traces of oil, frost, and earth, a memory of endurance quietly communicated. And in the hush of night, a story unfolded not in battle or victory, but in subtle, measured, and unhurried power. Even the enemy whispered its name, with reluctant respect. The early morning mist clung to the outskirts of Kharkiv, softening the edges of warehouses and rail yards. Trains groaned under the weight of disassembled machines, steel plates, and the fragile hopes of entire communities. Engineers and laborers worked quietly, moving piece by piece, each task deliberate and measured, despite the urgency around them. Frost covered the rails, making each step a careful negotiation. Yet the rhythm of industry persisted, slow and insistent. Women and children lent their hands to the effort, their fingers red from cold but nimble and steady. Tools whispered against metal, each strike echoing faintly, a subtle song in the still air. Morozov paused to watch, noting the cadence of movement, the delicate choreography between human and steel. Even distant smoke rose like a soft ribbon into pale skies, marking the progress of survival. The landscape, though bleak and cold, seemed to pulse with energy, each step a heartbeat of determination. And as the day advanced, the hum of machines in transit became a quiet testament to endurance. The rhythm of movement carried the promise of renewal through frost-laden fields. By midday, the columns of trains snaked through the countryside, each car laden with components and ambition. Koshkin walked along the platforms, observing workers stacking and securing pieces, noting how effort and care intertwined. Children carried small tools, their hands careful, eyes bright with focus despite biting wind. Women adjusted engines and treads, murmuring softly as they aligned components with precision. The metallic scent of steel mingled with smoke from locomotives, a subtle perfume of labor and resilience. The ground beneath them was uneven, frozen in places, softened in others, demanding attentiveness and patience. Conversations were sparse, each word measured against the sound of movement, like punctuation in a soft poem. Even distant birds seemed to hesitate in flight, observing the meticulous activity below. Every action became part of a greater cadence, the assembly of motion, thought, and hope. And through the chill and effort, a quiet solidarity grew, knitting together strangers into a community of purpose. From the frost and labor arose a heartbeat that carried across miles of tracks. The landscape shifted as trains rolled toward the Urals, each mile softening past and hardening future. Factories that had once hummed in cities were now disassembled, transported, and reassembled with deliberate care. The air carried a crispness that reminded workers of distance and separation, yet also of opportunity. Steel beams rose under careful hands, forming skeletons that would cradle engines and treads. Children traced lines on parts, their small movements precise, guided by adults who whispered instructions gently. Even the distant forests seemed to hold their breath, acknowledging the persistence of human effort. Morozov and Koshkin walked through temporary sheds, noting how the machinery found rhythm again despite dislocation. Snow brushed against cold windows, softening light into silver pools on the floor. The rhythm of labor became poetic, each hammer struck a soft drumbeat of endurance. And in the echo of movement, the T-34's future began to solidify, piece by piece, under patient hands. Each motion became a stanza in the quiet poetry of survival. As the evening sun dipped behind distant ridges, shadows lengthened across frozen ground. Workers continued their tasks with calm determination, guided by practiced repetition and careful instruction. Steam from furnaces curled softly into the cold air, mingling with frost and exhalations of breath. Children helped slide steel plates into position, their movements small but meaningful in the larger choreography of industry. Morozov noted the subtle sway of engines as they were aligned, recording minor adjustments that would shape future production. Women adjusted bolts and treads with deliberate patience, fingers tracing contours with knowledge born of necessity. Even the distant sound of a train whistle seemed to blend into the rhythm, part of a larger symphony of progress. The cold bit had exposed skin, yet warmth rose from the collective effort, subtle and insistent. Each completed section of assembly became a quiet triumph, a marker of resilience amidst uncertainty, and through the long shadows, the heartbeat of the factory carried steadily, calm yet determined. The machines moved not only through space, but through the patience and care of hands that built them. Night fell gently over the Urals, soft stars emerging above distant ridges. Temporary shelters glowed faintly with the warmth of lanterns, illuminating hands and faces bent over careful work. Koshkin and Morozov paused outside, listening to the faint clink of tools, the soft hum of engines finding alignment. Even the wind seemed tempered, brushing lightly over frozen ground, respecting the quiet intensity of creation. Children lay down briefly, exhausted yet fulfilled, their minds tracing the paths of movement they had participated in. Women adjusted final pieces, whispering instructions that balanced precision and care. The snow reflected pale light into open windows, softening the edges of steel and timber. Each piece assembled was more than metal. It was a promise, a pulse of endurance carved in quiet determination. And through this gentle night, the factory persisted, moving steadily forward despite distance, cold, and uncertainty. From the stillness of exile, effort became the lifeblood of survival. Morning arrived with silver light brushing over frozen tracks and half-built factories. The rhythm of hammers resumed, synchronized across sheds and temporary workshops. Morozov moved between stations, noting the way repetition had evolved into fluid motion. Each worker and machine aligned in quiet harmony. Koshkin observed treads sliding into position, engines resting upon supports, wheels adjusted and aligned with meticulous care. Even the distant wind seemed to carry the song of assembly, sweeping through trees and tents, blending effort with natural hush. Snow crunched softly beneath boots, a steady percussion that mirrored the internal cadence of labor. Children resumed small tasks, their energy renewed by the shared purpose around them. Every bolt fastened, every plate positioned, spoke of resilience, patience, and the subtle poetry of endurance. And as day stretched across frozen fields, the pulse of industry became a heartbeat, a rhythm steady and reassuring. The T-34 was no longer just a machine. It was the echo of a nation moving as one. By afternoon, assembly lines stretched across temporary yards, soft clouds of steam rising into pale skies. Workers moved in patterns that had become second nature, every gesture deliberate, every motion calm yet purposeful. Morozov and Koshkin noted minor adjustments that smoothed inefficiencies, enhancing both rhythm and output. Children carried small tools between stations, their careful steps forming part of the gentle symphony of labor. Snow shifted in drifts, reflecting the muted sunlight into soft silver paths across metal and timber. The sound of hammers sliding plates and whispered instructions combined into an industrial melody, hypnotic in its quiet insistence. Even distant forests seemed to bow under the effort, absorbing the subtle energy radiating from human determination. Each completed tank became a monument not to war but to patient coordination and shared endurance. And through it all, the rhythm continued, measured, calm, and unyielding, carrying the heartbeat of a people determined to persist. And from the smoke of exile, a nation's heartbeat became the rhythm of 1,000 hammers. The morning light fell softly across distant factories, spilling through windows into workshops where engineers measured, adjusted, and dreamed. Winter's chill lingered, brushing frozen metal and dust-covered floors with delicate frost. The T-34 had returned from the front lines, bringing stories of endurance and subtle triumph, shaping the hands and minds that worked to improve it. Morozov moved along benches, noting refinements in suspension, armor, and turret design. Koshkin observed, hands resting on smooth steel, imagining how subtle changes could shift the rhythm of survival on distant fields. Even the hum of electricity in the workshop seemed gentle, a companion to patient labor rather than a signal of urgency. Workers adjusted bolts with careful precision, fingers moving in practiced choreography, each motion deliberate and calm. Outside, snow softened the landscape, light reflecting in quiet pools upon frozen ground. Every improvement, every tweak, became a soft ripple of hope, unseen yet profoundly felt. and in that quiet the machine evolved, embodying both experience and the gentle persistence of care. Change did not announce itself, but whispered its presence through thoughtful motion. By midday, the T-34 prototypes rolled slowly across test grounds, treads pressing into thawed earth and ice alike. The engineers noted the subtle differences, each adjustment manifesting as grace, strength, and reliability. Frost lingered along edges, glinting faintly, highlighting contours of improvement. Soldiers nearby observed silently, feeling a quiet confidence settle in their steps. The hum of engines blended with the soft sigh of wind through trees, creating a rhythm that felt almost alive. Morozov recorded observations, every vibration and shift captured as a note in the ongoing story of refinement. Koshkin adjusted valves gently, ensuring that new armor and mechanisms worked in harmony rather than stress. Even distant birds seemed to pause in flight, observing calm persistence in motion below. Every rotation of the tracks became a meditation on endurance, a testament to lessons learned and improvements earned. And as the sun shifted toward late afternoon, hope settled like gentle snow across frozen fields. The promise of change moved quietly, measured in careful repetition and deliberate motion. Across quiet halls, engineers spoke in soft tones, voices blending with the low hum of machinery. Adjustments were subtle, a turret slightly reinforced, an engine tuned for persistence, treads improved to glide over frozen soil. Frost clung to windows, softening light into gentle silver pools upon floors cluttered with tools. Koshkin paused to touch cold steel, imagining distant battlefields where these refinements might carry both machine and men with quiet assurance. Workers moved deliberately, each action a whisper in the symphony of improvement. Morozov traced diagrams with careful fingers, balancing past lessons with future potential. Outside, wind brushed against rooftops, scattering light snow across tempered steel, a natural rhythm accompanying human effort. Even distant forests seemed still, absorbing the quiet energy that emanated from patient hands. Every minor change carried weight, subtle yet transformative, building confidence that rippled outward. And through these gentle acts, the T-34's spirit evolved, steady and unhurried. Hope did not shout. It grew in measured steps, invisible yet certain. In testing fields, engineers observed the tank navigate soft mud and icy ruts, learning anew from each movement. Soldiers moved alongside, noting smooth rotations, steadier engines, and a quiet assurance that had not existed before. The T-34 seemed aware of itself, responding to weight, slope, and resistance with calm precision. Light reflected off newly adjusted armor, soft and muted in winter's low sun. Koshkin and Morozov exchanged quiet observations, fingers tracing edges and joints, noting improvements that hinted at resilience beyond steel alone. Frosted earth pressed into treads, creating soft imprints that vanished slowly with wind and thaw. Each repetition strengthened understanding, each adjustment a subtle lesson in endurance and trust. The hum of the machine became a rhythm that echoed in human hearts, a meditation in motion. And as the day waned, the gentle pulse of improvement carried forward the unspoken promise of better days. Each turn of the wheel whispered possibility into frozen air. Late afternoon brought soft shadows across workshops where blueprints lay open and revisions were sketched in gentle pencil lines. Workers adjusted components, occasionally pausing to touch cold steel and imagine distant plains where these machines would carry hope. Morozov noted that even subtle adjustments changed weight distribution and rhythm, creating smoother motion and quieter operation. Kolskin moved along benches, observing how minor refinements affected the tank's response and the confidence of the crews who would command it. Outside, snow drifted lazily, reflecting pale light through frost-covered windows. The machines themselves seemed to breathe, responding to human touch with gentle, deliberate motion. Engineers whispered instructions and observations, careful not to break the quiet rhythm of reflection and labor. Each completed prototype carried lessons learned from months of hardship and subtle triumphs. And in this calm diligence, the T-34 was more than steel and mechanics. It was the embodiment of patient hope. The promise of endurance flowed silently through each measured action. Evening fell over the test grounds, soft light fading into a pale horizon. The T-34 rested after its trials, engine cooling into a gentle sigh that blended with the wind. Soldiers lingered nearby, noting the subtle improvements in armor and agility, feeling a quiet confidence take root. Koshkin touched cold steel, imagining distant battlefields where these changes would tip the balance of uncertainty into measured strength. Morozov recorded minor vibrations and rotations, cataloging every lesson for future iterations. Snow drifted across tracks, leaving delicate impressions that echoed the tank's calm persistence. The world seemed to pause in observation, the distant forests absorbing the low hum of history in progress. Every adjustment, every soft touch, carried the weight of collective experience and patience. And in that evening hush, the T-34 stood as a quiet signal that change could arrive gently, yet powerfully. Change did not come in a roar. It came in the hum of a stronger engine. Night settled softly, stretching long shadows across snow-flecked fields and frost-lined tracks. The engineers lingered in quiet reflection, listening to faint echoes of treads and the gentle vibration of engines winding down. Stars pierced the dark sky, indifferent witnesses to human care and calculated evolution below. Wind whispered through skeletal trees, brushing across steel and footprints alike, carrying traces of motion and persistence. Workers retired to nearby shelters, murmuring softly of adjustments and possibilities, their thoughts entwined with the calm rhythm of progress. Koshkin and Morozov considered the journey from sketches to evolution, the patient growth that turned uncertainty into confidence. Each refined tank was not just an instrument of war, but a testament to deliberate endurance, careful thought, and subtle courage. Even in stillness, the T-34 communicated its quiet strength, embodying the promise of a brighter, steadier future. And through the long winter night, hope endured in the hum of engines and the gentle rhythm of human hands. In quiet halls and frost-laden fields, persistence became the pulse of change. Morning arrived over snow-blanketed plains, pale sunlight scattering across frozen forests and distant ridges. The Red Army moved quietly, soldiers' footsteps muffled by soft snow, their breath rising in faint clouds of mist. Along the outskirts of Moscow, anticipation hummed in the air, subdued yet tangible, like wind pressing gently against a frost-hardened tree. T-34s rolled steadily across frozen roads, their tracks leaving delicate impressions that marked resilience more than conquest. Morozov and Koshkin watched from temporary command posts, noting the machine's measured progress and subtle authority. The tank's engines whispered through the silence, a gentle hum that carried reassurance across soldiers' hearts. Even distant birds remained still, their flight paused by the calm rhythm of human and machine in quiet unity. Frost shimmered along metal edges, softening contours and blending steel into the muted whiteness of winter. Soldiers aligned themselves with each machine, feeling a newfound confidence settle in, subtle yet undeniable. And across the frozen landscape, A quiet pulse of strength began to assert itself, steady and persistent. Beneath frost and snow, endurance took root, like a hidden spring. Throughout the morning, columns of T-34 SAR moved with precision along frost-lined paths, each rotation of the tracks translating careful design into quiet authority. Soldiers whispered to one another, noting the ease with which these machines navigated ice and uneven terrain. The tank's movement was steady, deliberate, and unhurried, communicating persistence rather than aggression. Morozov felt a subtle satisfaction, noting how refinements in armor and engine had translated into resilience visible in real time. Koshkin touched cold steel, imagining distant fields where similar rhythm and care might tip uncertain moments toward hope. Snowflakes drifted lazily, settling on hardened metal, softening edges while reflecting pale light into tiny pools. The air carried the muted scent of frost and earth, a delicate perfume that mingled with the hum of engines. Each machine seemed to exude quiet confidence, teaching soldiers that endurance could withstand both cold and chaos. Shadows stretched along the frozen ridges, softening the stark lines of earth and steel alike. And in that muted clarity, the T-34 became more than machine. It became a symbol of measured courage. Even in the hush of winter, strength moved with gentle determination. By midday, frost-lined villages witnessed the quiet advance of steel across frozen fields. Soldiers paused at intervals, observing the smooth motion of treads pressing into icy soil, leaving delicate patterns behind. The T-34 moved with patience, never hurried, yet asserting an unmistakable presence. Morozov recorded vibrations, noting subtle shifts that revealed the machine's growing confidence on uneven terrain. Koshkin observed infantry aligning with the tanks, footsteps soft but purposeful, forming a rhythm alongside mechanical motion. Wind rustled through frost-laden trees, carrying soft echoes of movement into quiet hollows. Even distant smoke from warming fires seemed to rise slower, suspended in the calm atmosphere of careful anticipation. The tank's presence offered reassurance more than alarm, a quiet certainty that persistence could hold the line where others faltered. Snow glinted against armor edges, softening the contrast between human and machine, blending them into a harmonious landscape. And as the day stretched, each gentle rotation of treads reinforced the quiet miracle of endurance taking hold along Moscow's edge. In this frozen expanse, resolve spread softly, like shadows moving with the sun. Afternoon brought shifting light across ridges and fields, casting elongated silhouettes of steel over pristine snow. Soldiers moved alongside, noticing subtle differences between machines, each adjustment a quiet whisper of refinement and resilience. The T-34s pressed forward steadily, their engines low and even, humming a rhythm that seemed to echo in hearts as well as across earth. Morozov paused to trace a line along a wheel, imagining how patience and calculation had produced such dependable motion. Koshkin observed snowflakes clinging to tracks and turrets, fragile reminders of nature moving alongside machine. Even distant woods seemed attentive, branches stiff yet soft, absorbing the calm progression of motion below. Soldiers spoke softly, recounting brief moments of awe, marveling at how the machine's presence tempered unease. Frost shimmered across windows of nearby outposts, reflecting soft, muted light that danced along steel. Each rotation, each measured advance, became both lesson and comfort, teaching patience and persistence in quiet, hypnotic rhythm. And beneath the low sun, courage grew subtly, nurtured by the quiet authority of treads across frozen soil. Beneath the frost, strength found a voice that did not shout but whispered insistently. Evening crept across the snow-blanketed plains, stretching long shadows along tracks and ridges. T-34 rested briefly, engines cooling with faint sighs into the still air. Soldiers lingered nearby, observing the machine's calm repose, drawing subtle reassurance from the quiet presence. Morozov traced frost patterns along steel, noting how environmental challenges had been absorbed with ease. Koshkin observed shadows falling across tracks and armor, softening edges and lending tranquility to otherwise harsh landscapes. Wind brushed lightly through trees and over snowdrifts, carrying faint metallic scents that mingled with pine and frozen earth. Even the distant horizon seemed softened, blending fields, steel and frost into a harmonious whole. The soldiers' voices were hushed, sharing brief stories of persistence and subtle victories, tempered by respect and careful observation. Every detail of the machines seemed imbued with quiet authority, their presence shaping the rhythm of human thought and action. And as night approached, Moscow's edge seemed held not by force alone, but by deliberate, measured endurance. Across frost and shadow, a new kind of courage began to grow. Night fell gently, the horizon fading into soft shades of blue and silver. T-34 SARS rested in ordered rows, engines silent, tracks leaving delicate impressions in snow, softened by evening air. Soldiers crouched beside fires, sharing whispered observations and gentle reassurance, their focus drawn as much to the calm of machine as to their own persistence. Morozov reflected on months of work, improvements, and careful observation, noting how each refinement had blossomed into reliable performance. Koshkin's hands lingered on steel, tracing lines of careful design, imagining the distant fields where these machines would shape outcomes quietly yet decisively. Wind brushed across frozen ridges, carrying faint echoes of movement and preparation. Even distant trees seemed still, leaning into the soft rhythm of quiet winter night. Each tank represented not only mechanical success, but the patient endurance of countless hands, minds, and hopes. And beneath the veil of frost, a silent miracle persisted, bridging human courage and deliberate design. Beneath the frost, a new kind of courage began to grow. Morning light spread softly over snow-blanketed fields, fragile and pale against the stillness of frost. Tracks of T-34 interrupted pristine snow, some steady and purposeful, others fading where machines had faltered. Soldiers moved quietly among remnants, voices subdued, carrying stories of endurance and subtle loss. Engines that had hummed with quiet authority now stood silent, their presence a soft reminder of both achievement and sacrifice. Morozov and Koshkin walked along rows of tracks, observing impressions left by machines that had pressed forward bravely and others that had been claimed by cold and terrain. Wind brushed across frozen ridges, scattering soft snow over scattered equipment, creating delicate blankets over the scars of battle. Even distant forests seemed still, holding memory in their silent branches. The hum of past engines lingered in imagination, a gentle echo of effort and resilience. Each fallen machine carried with it the imprint of human dedication, both measured and profound. And in the hush of winter morning, survival and cost coexisted in quiet equilibrium. The frost seemed to absorb the echoes of motion, leaving memory in its soft, white folds. By midday, the snow reflected muted light across fields where T-34 had once moved with careful precision. Soldiers walked slowly among abandoned tracks, stepping softly to avoid disturbing, fragile impressions. Morozov traced subtle depressions in frozen earth, noting how weight and movement had left delicate signatures of perseverance. Koshkin observed bent treads and partially buried steel, evidence of machines that had endured as long as they could. Wind shifted across open plains, carrying faint metallic scents mingled with the crisp cold of early winter. Each lost tank became both a monument to endurance and a reminder of human vulnerability. Even distant hills seemed softened, shadows blending the contours of earth, steel, and memory. Snowflakes drifted lightly, settling on frozen surfaces, muffling silence with gentle sound. Soldiers whispered stories of bravery and quiet resolve, voices calm yet weighted with reverence. And through these measured steps, the T-34's role as both protector and witness was quietly understood. In the hush of loss, devotion found subtle expression. Afternoon light slanted across frozen tracks, softening harsh angles into gentle gradients of silver and grey. Machines that had endured carried scars, muted under layers of snow, reminders of both persistence and fragility. Soldiers adjusted their movements, careful to honor impressions left by metal and treads alike. Morozov noted subtle variations in engine housings, reflecting how endurance had met resistance in the field. Koshkin considered the interplay of design and circumstance, the quiet calculus of survival beneath relentless cold. Wind stirred lightly across distant ridges, carrying whispers of distant engines and past movement. Even the skeletal trees along frozen streams seemed to bend slightly, as if bowing to the efforts and losses recorded beneath their branches. Snow shifted softly over exposed tracks, erasing some evidence while preserving the quiet outline of persistence. Each abandoned machine became a meditation on impermanence, strength, and gentle remembrance, and through the cold and quiet, lessons endured, transmitted in silence and frost. The frozen earth held the memory of effort in delicate, enduring traces. As evening approached, shadows lengthened across open plains and icy hollows. Soldiers lingered beside half-buried steel, soft voices recounting quiet moments of courage and patience. The T-34, some upright, some partially hidden in drifts, formed a silent line of devotion across the landscape. Morozov walked slowly along the frozen field, noting subtle depressions, bends, and shifts in the terrain left by tireless machines. Koshkin paused to touch a cold hull, imagining distant crews and the steady pulse of effort that had animated the tank. Even distant forests seemed to lean toward the field, observing quietly in winter's softened light. Snowflakes fell slowly, resting gently on steel and earth, as if preserving memory in fragile layers. Soldiers reflected on moments of endurance, tracing paths once taken with careful thought and subdued respect. Each lost machine was simultaneously a testament and a requiem, recording devotion in quiet steel. And as night drew near, the field whispered of persistence, sacrifice, and the delicate balance between them. Beneath the dimming sky, resilience and loss intertwined softly. Night descended with silver light, stretching over frost-laden tracks and soft mounds of snow. Engines rested, cold and quiet, leaving faint traces of warmth dissipated into the chilled air. Soldiers huddled nearby, speaking in hushed tones, recounting distant movements, measured accomplishments, and subtle losses. Morozov observed each T-34, tracing lines with the tip of his glove, imagining journeys undertaken and moments endured. Koshkin noted the silence that enveloped the field, punctuated only by the whisper of wind and occasional settling snow. Shadows softened across steel and earth, blurring distinctions between human and machine, persistence and impermanence. Each vehicle, fallen or intact, seemed to communicate its own quiet story of endurance. The frost reflected dim stars, offering a gentle contrast to the muted tones of the landscape below. Soldiers murmured gratitude, reverence, and reflection, weaving human emotion into the frozen narrative of machinery. And in the still night, devotion lingered as a soft, enduring presence among the snow and steel. Even in stillness, each track spoke of commitment beyond words. By midnight, the landscape lay muted and calm, frozen impressions preserved under moonlight. The T-34, scattered and quiet, bore witness to countless journeys across snow, earth, and hardship. Morozov moved slowly among the machines, taking in their silent testimony, reflecting on effort, ingenuity, and endurance. Koshkin noted how each bent tread, each faintly dented hull, told stories of persistence under quiet pressure. Snow shifted gently across exposed surfaces, softening edges and creating delicate blankets over the scars of movement and service. Even distant hills seemed to lean softly into night, observing the field without disturbance. Soldiers rested near small fires, voices hushed, letting silence carry lessons and memory. Each machine carried the quiet weight of service, sometimes unrecognized, sometimes visible only in subtle traces of effort. And through the frozen night, the T-34 remained both guardian and memorial, embodying devotion etched in cold and steel. Each tank that burned left behind not defeat, but devotion. Dawn approached with pale light brushing over frost and abandoned steel, softening the horizon into muted blues and grays. The landscape seemed suspended, every track and impression frozen in time, echoing quiet persistence. Soldiers moved with deliberate steps, careful not to disturb delicate traces left behind. Morozov recorded the subtle patterns of treads and depressions, reflecting on human and mechanical endurance alike. Koshkin considered the interplay of loss and survival, noting how each abandoned machine had fulfilled its purpose in quiet ways. Even the wind whispered through skeletal trees, carrying faint echoes of past motion and measured courage. Snow drifted softly over exposed surfaces, preserving memory and muffling the still air. The T-34 stood as gentle monuments, silent yet eloquent, teaching lessons of resilience, effort, and respect. Soldiers paused to honor these lessons, their reflections merging with frost, steel, and quiet horizon. And in this fragile light, survival and sacrifice existed together, bound by the soft rhythm of devotion. Through snow and silence, the T-34's endurance was remembered as quiet devotion. Morning light spread across the plains of Kursk, soft and pale, masking the scale of what was to come. Lines of T-34, sea-rested in frost-laden fields, engines humming quietly, a rhythm almost meditative against the vastness of Earth. Soldiers moved alongside, adjusting equipment, and noting the alignment of tracks and treads, each gesture deliberate, measured, calm. Morozov observed the machines with reflective pride, noting how months of refinement had culminated in silent, steady power. Koshkin traced fingers along metal edges, feeling both weight and balance, imagining how subtle adjustments might influence endurance under pressure. Even distant forests seemed to lean slightly, as if acknowledging the careful presence of machines and men. Snow softened the contours of ridges and earthworks, creating gentle shadows that blended terrain and steel into harmonious patterns. The T-34 waited, their stillness resonating with quiet authority, a subtle reassurance to the human hearts aligned beside them. Each rotation of wheels, each whispered observation, contributed to the rhythm of anticipation, like the calm before a storm. And across the wide horizon, the stage was set for endurance and resolve to meet history. The earth itself seemed to prepare, folding hills and fields into a gentle rhythm of expectation. By midday, the plains began to hum with quiet movement as T-34 Ser rolled forward, each track pressing softly into thawing earth. Soldiers walked alongside in measured steps, coordinating motion with careful attention to rhythm and terrain. Morozov noted vibrations and subtle shifts in metal, recording lessons as engines traced slow, deliberate arcs. Koshkin observed light glinting along softened armor, reflecting clouds drifting gently across pale blue skies. Even distant birds seemed suspended, wings still, observing the quiet persistence of machine and human in tandem. The T-34 Sayers moved not with haste, but with quiet confidence, each rotation of treads a heartbeat in the vast snowy expanse. Wind brushed across frozen ridges, scattering snow lightly and blending motion with stillness. Shadows lengthened softly over the plains, mixing earth, steel, and human presence into an unhurried tapestry. Each advance was a meditation on resilience, strength, and deliberate endurance. And as the afternoon stretched, the T-34 Sayers seemed to breathe alongside soldiers, harmonizing purpose and persistence. Even amidst anticipation, the rhythm of motion held a gentle, hypnotic cadence. Afternoon light shifted across hills, softening edges and creating pools of pale illumination across armored steel. Soldiers adjusted minor alignments, whispering instructions as engines hummed their steady, unobtrusive song. Morozov and Koshkin observed patterns in motion, noting how machine and earth interacted with subtle grace, as if the terrain itself had become part of a quiet dialogue. Snow drifted lazily, settling into tracks, softening impressions yet preserving the history of movement. Each T-34 carried lessons from past winters, past fields, and past refinements, translating patience into performance. Even distant trees seemed to lean in, absorbing the gentle cadence of motion across plains and ridges. Soldiers' steps fell in quiet harmony with hums and whispers of metal, each gesture deliberate and mindful. Shadows stretched slowly, blending earth and steel into a muted palette of silver, grey, and frost. The rhythm of endurance moved steadily, carrying both machine and men toward a silent threshold of challenge. And in that measured pace, the T-34 revealed its quiet authority, steady yet commanding. The plains seemed to hum softly, with the presence of patience in motion. Evening approached with gentle light falling across long stretches of frozen ground. T-34 Sev rested briefly in shallow depressions, tracks pressing subtly into softened snow. Soldiers lingered near engines, checking alignment and noting shifts, voices soft in reverent observation. Morozov traced subtle patterns along armor, reflecting on months of trial, refinement, and patient development. Koshkin observed tracks pressed into earth, imagining the stories of endurance embedded in each tread. Wind shifted lightly across distant ridges, carrying whispers of movement and soft echoes of exertion. Snowflakes drifted slowly, settling over steel and earth, preserving the quiet imprint of dedication. Each machine, silent yet purposeful, carried the weight of accumulated skill, endurance, and subtle courage. Even the horizon seemed softened, the landscape bending gently under fading light and shadow. And as night crept in, the T-34's presence became a quiet anchor, a calm assurance amidst the vast plains of anticipation. In the hush of approaching night, resilience and motion coexisted softly. Night descended over frost-lined fields, casting long shadows across tracks and armored hulls. Engines rested quietly, hums dissipated into cold air, leaving a gentle stillness across the expanse. Soldiers huddled in clusters, murmuring softly, recounting observations and small victories with subdued reverence. Morozov moved slowly, tracing impressions left by treads, reflecting on endurance and subtle triumph. Koshkin touched the cold steel of a turret, feeling weight, balance, and history compressed into form. Snow drifted lightly, settling into depressions, preserving delicate signatures of effort and movement. Even distant hills seemed to absorb the quiet, bending softly beneath the weight of calm presence. Each machine stood as a silent testament to careful preparation, refinement, and persistent attention. Shadows merged into the landscape, blending earth, steel, and human presence into a soft tableau. And in that gentle night, the T-34 embodied patient strength, a quiet force resting in anticipation. Beneath the hush of night, preparation became presence, deliberate and serene. By midnight, the frost reflected muted starlight across fields dotted with silent machines. Soldiers moved softly, checking alignment and preserving delicate impressions left in snow. Morozov observed patterns of tracks and treads, noting subtle lessons written in frozen earth. Koshkin paused beside a turret, imagining how refined motion would meet the challenges of tomorrow. Wind whispered faintly through skeletal trees, scattering soft snow over steel and footprints alike. Even distant ridges seemed softened by moonlight, shadows blending earth, snow, and machinery into gentle continuity. Each resting tank seemed to exude calm authority, its presence both reassuring and measured. Soldiers murmured quietly, drawing strength from motion suspended in time, and learning from the subtle poetry of endurance. And through the silent night, the T-34 carried history forward, a steady heartbeat of resilience in frozen expanse. When the Earth itself became armor, the T-34 met its destiny. Morning light filtered through drifting smoke over the fields of Prokhorovka, softening the harsh outlines of steel and earth. Tracks pressed into snow and mud told stories of endurance, effort, and quiet persistence. Soldiers moved slowly among the remnants, their voices low, carrying whispers of the day's exertions. The T-34, standing or fallen, seemed to breathe in the stillness, their presence both reassuring and solemn. Morozov traced lines along treads and armor, imagining the countless hands that had guided these machines across the frozen plain. Koshkin observed the muted light reflecting softly against steel, shadows blending contours into gentle, almost painterly shapes. Even distant forests seemed paused, branches stiff in frost, holding quiet witness to movement now stilled. Snowflakes drifted lazily, settling over impressions in frozen earth, preserving subtle signatures of motion. Each tank, each footprint, became a meditation on endurance, courage, and the cost of persistence. And in that smoky calm, the T-34's legend began, quietly woven into memory and frost. As smoke lingered, even the silence seemed to honor what had endured. By midday, muted sunlight painted the landscape in soft grays and silver, reflecting off frozen tracks and frost-covered steel. Soldiers moved with measured steps, examining engines, treads, and faintly bent armor, reverent in their quiet attentiveness. Morozov and Koshkin observed, noting the subtle endurance that had allowed machines to persist through exhaustion and environmental resistance. Snow drifted gently over abandoned tracks, softening edges while preserving the memory of motion. Wind whispered through skeletal trees and across the plain, carrying quiet echoes of hums, footsteps, and distant effort. Even hills and ridges seemed softened under muted light, the contours of earth blending with the impressions of man and machine. Each T-34 told a story of determination, subtle triumph, and the patience embedded in design and practice. Soldiers murmured soft reflections, voices merging with the gentle rhythm of winter and observation. The machines themselves seemed to hold memory, as if the steel carried an echo of every hand, every engine hum, and every measured advance. And as afternoon edged toward evening, the landscape exhaled a quiet calm, a soft punctuation of resilience. Even in stillness, the memory of persistence lingered in delicate impressions. Afternoon light shifted across snow-dusted hulls, painting gentle gradients over steel and frozen earth. Soldiers moved slowly, tracing subtle lines of tracks, and observing bends and depressions left by steadfast treads. Morozov noted how each vehicle, intact or partially embedded in snow, carried lessons of quiet endurance. Koshkin's gaze lingered on turrets, imagining distant landscapes where patience and design had met harsh resistance. Snowflakes fell softly, settling over metal, merging cold steel with frozen ground in a muted, tranquil tableau. Even distant woods seemed attentive, branches silent, holding witness to the calm aftermath of exertion. Soldiers whispered reflections on perseverance, courage, and subtle victories, their tone low and contemplative. Each T-34 seemed both sentinel and participant, recording effort in quiet lines of frost and shadow. Shadows stretched gently across the plains, blending contours of earth, machine, and human presence. And in that lingering hush, the quiet legend of the T-34 was etched into both snow and memory. In the soft light, endurance and devotion resonated like a silent hymn. Evening settled softly over frost-lined tracks and muted ridges, long shadows stretching across frozen earth. Soldiers lingered beside resting tanks, voices subdued, recounting quiet tales of motion and determination. Morozov and Koshkin observed gently, noting how machines held both presence and calm authority in stillness. Snow drifted across frozen impressions, settling lightly over tracks, armor, and footprints. Wind moved across ridges and hollows, carrying faint metallic scents and echoes of effort into quiet hollows. Even distant hills seemed softened, blending into the muted palette of steel, frost, and memory. Each vehicle, upright or partially embedded in snow, became a testament to perseverance, design, and subtle courage. Soldiers murmured soft gratitude, reverence, and reflection, letting silence carry lessons learned across wintered plains. The T-34s themselves seemed to breathe softly in repose, embodying both endurance and the quiet weight of history. And as night approached, the legend of these machines settled gently across earth and imagination alike. As the sun faded, silence deepened, carrying both calm and memory. Night enveloped fields, silver light reflecting softly off steel and frost. Engines cooled to faint whispers, leaving a gentle stillness across tracks and impression-laden earth. Soldiers rested near smoldering fires, voices hushed, drawing solace from quiet reflection and muted memory. Morozov traced delicate lines along treads, imagining all the journeys undertaken, every measured advance across frozen plains. Koshkin considered the interplay of human care, patience, and steel, noting subtle persistence preserved even in absence. Snow drifted lightly, softening outlines, while preserving impressions in frozen ground. Distant ridges seemed softened by moonlight, blending earth, machine, and shadow into a gentle whole. Each tank carried both history and quiet triumph, standing sentinel over lessons learned and patience exercised. Soldiers whispered softly, letting silence and frost convey what words could not. And through the calm of night, the legend of the T-34 was born, tempered by devotion and quiet endurance. In this muted night, steel and snow recorded stories of resilience. By midnight, Frost reflected soft starlight over fields dotted with silent T-34. Soldiers moved softly, checking tracks, leaving delicate traces in snow and preserving subtle signs of motion. Morozov and Koshkin observed with gentle care, tracing impressions left by engines and treads with reflective attention. Wind whispered across frozen plains, carrying faint echoes of motion and the subtle hum of endurance into night. Even distant trees seemed paused, branches holding memory in their frozen stillness. Each vehicle, resting quietly in snow or standing sentinel, embodied patient strength and calm persistence. Soldiers murmured softly of past exertions, victories, and endurance, voices merging with the quiet rhythm of winter night. Snow shifted gently over exposed metal, preserving the quiet traces of effort in delicate layers. And as the horizon faded into soft darkness, the T-34s themselves became both monument and memory, calm guardians of endurance. And as the smoke cleared, even silence seemed to stand at attention. Morning light fell gently over villages, recently liberated, soft beams stretching across fields once shadowed by conflict. Tracks of T-34 pressed into thawing earth, their presence both reassuring and solemn, marking progress and sacrifice alike. Soldiers walked slowly among impressions left in snow and mud, voices low, recounting moments of endurance and loss. Morozov traced subtle depressions in treads, reflecting on the duality of purpose, machines built for protection, yet inseparable from the weight of destruction. Koshkin observed frost glinting along metal edges, imagining distant families and landscapes touched by both hope and hardship. Even distant forests seemed softened, their branches holding witness to both liberation and quiet sorrow. Snow drifted lightly, settling over tracks and footprints, preserving delicate histories in silent white. Each machine, upright or partially buried, carried testimony of persistence, courage, and the cost of endurance. Soldiers whispered stories of relief and fatigue, their voices blending with the soft rhythm of wind and earth. And across the horizon, the T-34 remained both a symbol of hope and a reminder of quiet burdens carried through steel and frost. As the sun climbed, even liberated fields held traces of effort and reflection. By midday, light softened across frozen ridges and open plains, revealing tracks pressed deep into earth, softened by thaw and snow. Soldiers moved with careful steps, noting subtle shifts in armor and alignment as the T-34s continued their measured advance. Morozov observed patterns in treads and tracks, recognizing lessons written not only in steel, but in persistence under pressure. Koshkin traced faint impressions, contemplating the weight of progress alongside cost. Wind shifted gently over fields, carrying muted scents of smoke, frost, and distant earth, blending history with present effort. Even distant hills seemed softened, the contours of landscape and tracks merging into quiet continuity. Each T-34 told a story of endurance and silent struggle, moving steadily through space and memory. Soldiers murmured reflections on liberation, resilience, and subtle responsibility, voices merging with the muted cadence of snow and steel. Frost shimmered faintly along metal surfaces, softening edges and creating a gentle contemplative tableau. And through the calm of mid-afternoon, victory unfolded quietly, tempered by the weight of what it had taken to arrive. In every trace, every impression, the echo of effort lingered softly. Afternoon light cast gentle shadows across steel and frost, blending contours into muted patterns of silver and grey. Soldiers walked slowly alongside T-34s, observing tracks, engines, and subtle wear with reverent attention. Morozov noted how small adjustments in design had translated into measured endurance over varied terrain. Koshkin reflected on the quiet duality of the machine, a guardian in one moment, a witness to cost in the next. Snowflakes drifted lazily, settling over treads and armor, softening harsh impressions while preserving the memory of motion. Even distant forests seemed still, branches stiff with frost, quietly observing persistence and consequence. Each vehicle carried both hope and moral weight, reminders of survival intertwined with the cost borne by human hands. Soldiers' voices remained subdued, blending with the gentle hum of wind and settling snow. Shadows stretched softly across fields, mingling earth, steel, and human presence in contemplative balance. And in that muted light, the T-34 embodied both triumph and the subtle burden it carried along its path. Through frost and shadow, the dual nature of victory revealed itself quietly. Evening approached, painting snow and steel in pale amber, softening sharp edges and long impressions. T-34 Sirs rested briefly along ridges, tracks pressed into thawing earth, leaving subtle signs of deliberate motion. Soldiers lingered, moving with measured gestures, voices low and reflective, tracing the journey of endurance and moral weight. Morozov observed each vehicle, considering the human effort and care embedded in every rotation of wheels and treads. Koshkin paused beside a turret, imagining the quiet stories carried within steel of courage, fatigue, and restraint. Wind moved lightly across ridges, carrying faint scents of smoke and frost, blending distant memory with immediate presence. Even the horizon seemed softened, folding steel, earth, and human labor into gentle continuity. Each tank became both monument and memory, a silent teacher of responsibility, persistence, and quiet resilience. Soldiers murmured softly, reflecting on the intricate balance between hope, protection, and the costs endured. And as night drew near, the fields absorbed both achievement and burden, holding them softly in frost and shadow. In the calm of evening, the weight of victory settled gently across earth and steel. Night descended with muted light, scattering softly over frozen tracks and hulls, creating a quiet, contemplative atmosphere. Engines cooled to gentle whispers, leaving a hushed stillness that stretched across the landscape. Soldiers huddled in small groups, voices subdued, sharing reflections on liberation and the subtle burdens of action. Morozov moved slowly among T-34's tracing impressions, left in soft earth, reflecting on endurance and subtle lessons of responsibility. Koshkin observed frost settling over armor, imagining the stories held in every ridge, tread, and dent. Wind whispered across distant ridges and hollowed plains, carrying muted echoes of movement and the calm of persistence. Each tank bore witness to both triumph and weight, embodying hope and the moral complexity of survival. Snow drifted lightly, softening sharp impressions while preserving the quiet story of effort and determination. Soldiers murmured gratitude and reverence, voices blending with the gentle rhythm of wind and frozen earth. And in the deep hush of night, the T-34 remained both guardian and reminder, carrying victory alongside its subtle burdens. Even in stillness, steel held the weight of human endeavor. By midnight, the landscape lay muted beneath soft starlight, frost glinting gently over tracks and exposed steel. Soldiers moved quietly, leaving delicate traces in snow while preserving impressions of motion and effort. Morozov noted subtle depressions along treads, recording lessons written in frozen earth and gentle endurance. Koshkin observed quiet, reflective lines across armor, contemplating how persistence met both challenge and responsibility. Wind drifted softly across plains and ridges, carrying faint echoes of motion, blending past and present into a delicate rhythm. Even distant hills seemed softened by night, contours merging into muted continuity with steel and earth. Each T-34 bore stories of careful advance, measured courage, and subtle moral weight embedded in action. Soldiers murmured in reverence, voices blending with the calm hush of snow and frost. Snow settled across metal and footprints, preserving gentle history and quiet endurance. And through the muted night, the T-34 stood as both beacon and burden, a reminder of hope tempered by moral reflection. Victory was near, but it carried the scent of ashes. Morning light fell softly over shattered villages and flattened fields, dust and frost mingling in gentle layers across earth and steel. T-34 say, and remnants of other machines rested quietly, some upright, some partially embedded in mud, each telling subtle stories of perseverance and exhaustion. Soldiers moved slowly among them, checking engines, adjusting treads, and pausing to reflect, their voices low and measured. Civilians emerged from makeshift shelters, stepping carefully through footprints and impressions left in thawing earth, gathering remnants of daily life. Morozov observed delicate shifts in metal, noting how machines bore the memory of effort, endurance, and unintended consequence. Koshkin traced subtle bends along armor, imagining distant hands that had guided these machines through challenge and cold. Wind carried faint scents of smoke, frost, and damp earth, weaving memory and presence into soft, quiet motion. Snow drifted in light layers, settling over steel, footprints and impressions in frozen mud, preserving delicate traces of past movement. Each machine, whether standing or fallen, seemed to hum with quiet testimony, a subtle resonance of history and human persistence. And across this muted expanse, both soldiers and civilians moved together, bound by the shared rhythm of rebuilding and reflection. In quiet steps, even remnants of conflict became part of a gentle continuum. By midday, sunlight softened the edges of flattened walls and broken fences, painting gentle gradients across twisted metal. Soldiers adjusted engines and alignment, observing impressions left in mud and snow. Mindful of subtle wear and tear, civilians moved with careful steps, recovering belongings, salvaging wood, and tending small gardens among ruins. Morozov reflected on the subtle endurance of steel and human effort, noting how both were shaped by challenge and circumstance. Koshkin observed shadows stretching across treads and armor, softening lines and merging machine and earth into gentle continuity. Even distant hills seemed to lean softly, blending contours of ruins, frost, and quiet human activity. Each T-34 bore testimony to persistence, design, and silent resilience, while neighboring machines offered lessons in endurance under hardship. Snow drifted slowly, settling over tracks, footprints, and broken terrain, preserving delicate signatures of both movement and stillness. Soldiers murmured observations softly, blending reflection with reverence, their voices carrying across muted fields. And in the calm of afternoon, steel, earth, and human effort merged into a slow rhythm of quiet reconstruction. Even in ruin, traces of care and persistence whispered softly. Afternoon wind stirred lightly over shattered rooftops and frost-covered earth, scattering soft snow across metal and footprints. Soldiers continued methodical work, tracing tracks, adjusting treads, and observing the subtle interplay of movement and surface. Civilians gathered debris and timber, bending gently, their labor quiet yet persistent, a rhythm of restoration. Morozov traced subtle impressions along armor, imagining moments of motion and exertion recorded in metal. Koshkin paused beside a resting turret, considering the calm dialogue between machine and landscape, history and endurance. Even distant forests seemed attentive, branches motionless, holding witness to human and mechanical persistence. Each T-34, still and quiet, reflected lessons of resilience, determination, and patience embedded in design. Snowflakes drifted lazily, settling in soft layers, preserving the history of motion and the careful labor of reconstruction. Soldiers murmured quietly, voices blending with the gentle sigh of wind and settling snow. And through this soft tableau, the shared persistence of humans and machines created a calm, contemplative rhythm. Across muted plains, even silence carried the weight of shared endurance. Evening approached, casting soft amber light across flattened fields and frost-dusted steel. Soldiers and civilians moved with careful steps, maintaining a rhythm of observation and reconstruction. Morozov observed subtle depressions in treads, noting how enduring design had met challenge with quiet effectiveness. Koshkin considered the faint echoes of effort preserved in bent armor and pressed snow, reminders of persistence and patience. Wind shifted lightly over hills and ruins, carrying faint sounds of soft conversation and distant labor. Snow drifted gently, settling over impressions, tracks, and steel, preserving subtle memories of human and mechanical endeavor. Each tank, whether upright or partially embedded, embodied both history and quiet testimony of resilience. Soldiers murmured reflections, voices low, blending with the gentle hush of wind and frost. Civilians paused occasionally, resting briefly, their presence soft and deliberate in the vast, muted space. And in this gentle evening, the ruins became a canvas for quiet reconstruction and shared endurance. In soft light and drifting snow, even remnants of conflict seemed to breathe calm. Night fell gradually, silver light reflecting softly off steel, snow, and broken earth. Soldiers moved carefully, inspecting tracks, engines, and subtle impressions left in thawing soil. Civilians rested near small fires, voices hushed, reflecting on quiet restoration and effort. Morozov traced faint lines in frozen mud, contemplating the endurance captured in metal and footprints alike. Koshkin observed subtle gradients of frost across armor, imagining how persistence had shaped both machine and landscape. Wind whispered through skeletal trees, scattering snow lightly over impressions and tracks, blending presence and memory into quiet motion. Each T-34 seemed to hold gentle authority, its steel both a witness and participant in measured recovery. Soldiers murmured quietly, voices soft reflecting on persistence, labor, and subtle shared responsibility. Snow continued to drift, covering impressions and footprints in delicate layers of quiet history. And through the muted night, humans and machines alike existed in harmonious rhythm, bound by shared endurance and reflective calm. Even in shadow and frost, the quiet pulse of recovery persisted softly. By midnight, the landscape lay hushed beneath starlight, frost and snow creating muted contours across metal and earth. Soldiers moved slowly, leaving delicate traces ensuring that subtle history remained intact. Civilians paused, tending fires or quiet spaces, voices low, merging reflection with reverent observation. Morozov noted impressions along treads and tracks, recording lessons in endurance embedded in frozen earth. Koshkin observed steel glinting faintly under starlight, imagining distant hands and moments that had left quiet testimony in design. Wind drifted softly across plains and ridges, carrying muted echoes of motion and the calm of persistence. Even distant hills seemed softened, contours merging into gentle continuity with earth, steel, and human presence. Each T-34 bore witness to patient advancement, subtle triumphs, and quiet perseverance. Soldiers and civilians moved together, voices subdued, blending human effort with the silent authority of machines. And across the still night, Europe's ruins held echoes of endurance, reflection, and shared recovery. In the quiet after thunder, even enemies began to sound like echoes. Morning light glinted softly off rows of T-34 standing in quiet formation. Polished steel, reflecting the calm rhythm of a world trying to breathe again. Soldiers and civilians passed between them with measured steps, voices low, murmuring histories captured in metal and tread. Morozov traced subtle bends in armor, remembering winters, mud and fields that had shaped both machine and man. Koshkin observed shadows stretching across hulls, imagining distant landscapes now at peace, yet still marked by memory. Even distant trees seemed attentive, branches holding witness to triumphs, losses, and quiet endurance alike. Snow or dew settled gently across tracks and turrets, softening edges, while preserving the silent testimony of motion and effort. Each machine, whether marching in parades or standing sentinel in museums, carried stories of human perseverance and design. Soldiers murmured quietly, voices blending with soft wind, reflecting on the continuity between past exertions and present remembrance. The T-34 says themselves seem to breathe gently in the calm, absorbing memory, patience, and reverence. And in that quiet morning, the ghost of history moved softly through steel and frost, waiting to be noticed. Even in stillness, motion's memory lingered gently. By midday, light softened across parade grounds and museum halls, casting gentle reflections on polished armor and frozen impressions of past journeys. Soldiers walked slowly among the tanks, adjusting their steps to the quiet rhythm of remembrance. Morozov observed how subtle dents and scratches held stories of endurance and challenge, whispers of distant winters and summer advances. Koshkin noted the interplay of light and shadow across turrets, imagining hands that had worked tirelessly, guided by hope and duty. Wind carried faint scents of metal, frost, and distant earth, blending memory and present in a gentle, reflective cadence. Even distant hills seemed softened, the contours of landscape and steel merging into quiet continuity. Each T-34 bore witness to resilience, design, and persistence, silently narrating the stories of those who had moved and maintained them. Civilians and soldiers murmured softly, voices blending into the muted cadence of observation and reflection. Snowflakes or dust drifted gently across tracks, preserving impressions, reminders of quiet motion and effort. And through the calm of afternoon, the T-34s existed as both memory and presence, echoing endurance across generations. Steel and frost held subtle stories of time and remembrance. Afternoon light stretched long across parade squares and silent fields, softening sharp angles and the hard glint of metal. Soldiers moved slowly, observing treads, turrets, and subtle impressions left by careful handling and historical journeys. Morozov traced faint lines along armor, reflecting on winters, mud, and distant fields that had tested both human patience and mechanical resilience. Koshkin considered the interplay of shadow and surface, imagining hands, feet, and quiet voices preserved in the cold, enduring steel. Even distant trees swayed lightly in gentle wind, as if acknowledging past exertions and present calm. Each T-34 carried history in both form and quiet presence, their stillness a testament to endurance and reflection. Civilians moved among them, touching surfaces softly, whispering stories inherited from fathers, grandfathers, and soldiers long past. Snow or frost rested gently on turrets, preserving delicate impressions of endurance and silent persistence. Soldiers murmured low reflections, voices blending with the soft rhythm of air, metal, and earth. And across the muted afternoon, the legend of the T-34 lived quietly, echoing persistence and memory across time. In soft light, even steel seemed to remember gentle motion. Evening descended gradually, painting rows of tanks and frozen fields in soft gold and muted silver. Soldiers and civilians moved with calm attentiveness, tracing subtle impressions along treads, hulls, and armor. Morozov noted how each curve and bend reflected patience and endurance, echoing winters of frozen mud and long advances. Koshkin paused, imagining distant voices of soldiers, engineers and civilians carried forward in the quiet authority of steel. Wind drifted gently over parade grounds and museum halls, carrying whispers of history, memory, and reflection. Each T-34 seemed to hold quiet vigilance, absorbing the stories of human effort, perseverance, and quiet resilience. Soldiers murmured softly, their voices blending with distant echoes and muted shadows, reflecting on the enduring dialogue between man and machine. Snow or frost, dew or dust, settled lightly, preserving delicate traces of past motion and human care. The machines themselves seemed to pulse faintly with memory, a gentle resonance of the years, the winters, and the work performed. And in that evening calm, the T-34s became both guardians and historians, quietly echoing endurance into the soft horizon. Through shadow and stillness, history whispered softly from steel. Night arrived with muted starlight reflecting across frost treads and turreted silhouettes. Soldiers moved carefully, leaving delicate traces, voices low, their words merging with the calm rhythm of remembrance. Civilians lingered near machines, tracing subtle impressions, reflecting on endurance and the passage of time. Morozov observed soft reflections across armor, considering how design had preserved human effort and patience across harsh winters and long roads. Koshkin noted shadows mingling with gentle starlight, imagining hands that had built, repaired, and guided the T-34 in silence and determination. Wind whispered lightly across parade grounds, carrying faint echoes of steel, earth, and soft conversation. Each tank bore stories of resilience, triumph, and careful labor, standing in quiet witness to the past. Soldiers murmured low recollections, blending with soft snow and muted air, carrying subtle memories forward. Snow or frost settled over tracks and hulls, preserving impressions and soft whispers of movement. And across the tranquil night, the T-34 stood as quiet echoes, their presence a gentle conversation between history and reflection. Steel forgets no war, it only waits for peace to notice. Morning light brushed softly across a quiet memorial, where a T-34 rested in reverent stillness, its steel muted but proud. Visitors walked slowly among the tanks, their footsteps gentle, voices hushed, as if not to disturb the echo of history. Morozov reflected on how distant generations now encountered the machines, learning resilience and patience without stepping into frozen mud or snow. Koshkin traced faint impressions along hulls, remembering hands and winter winds that had tested both steel and spirit. Even distant trees seemed to sway quietly, their branches holding witness to decades of memory and reverence. Films and stories carried the T-34 across continents, replaying endurance, determination, and quiet persistence in the minds of millions. Snow or dew settled lightly on tracks, preserving soft signs of motion and remembrance. Soldiers and civilians alike moved with reverence, acknowledging the subtle dialogue between past and present, steel and reflection. Each machine whispered of years spent advancing, surviving, and teaching patience in silence. And across the calm morning, History's voice lingered softly, waiting to be felt by all who paused to listen. In stillness, even steel seemed to breathe the lessons of time. By midday, the light softened across parade grounds, museums, and memorials, casting gentle reflections over polished armor and silent treads. Children paused to touch the cold steel, voices quiet, imaginations tracing distant winters, and fields remembered only in stories. Morozov observed how each T-34 had become both teacher and witness, carrying human effort and endurance into new decades. Koshkin noted the interplay of shadow and sun, imagining the long line of hands that had repaired, maintained, and guided these machines through frost and mud. Even distant hills seemed softened, contours blending history, steel, and quiet reflection into a gentle continuum. Veterans walked slowly among tanks, fingers brushing gently along turret edges, eyes reflecting memories of endurance and careful labor. Snow, frost, or dew settled lightly on tracks and impressions, softening edges while preserving quiet history. Soldiers and civilians murmured stories softly, voices blending with the gentle hum of wind and steel. Each tank stood as a silent narrator, its presence conveying lessons of patience, persistence, and endurance without a single word. And across the soft afternoon, the T-34 continued to teach, echoing its story far beyond Berlin and its creators. Steel remembers quietly, whispering persistence across decades. Afternoon shadows stretched gently across frozen tracks, polished armor, and soft impressions in earth and concrete. Soldiers, civilians, and students moved slowly among the T-34 set, their presence careful, respectful, contemplative. Morozov traced subtle dents and scratches, each a quiet record of movement, endurance, and human care. Koshkin observed the interplay of light and shadow, imagining hands that once labored tirelessly in factories, fields, and frozen forests. Even distant trees seemed to pause, leaves still, branches holding the memory of motion and resilience. Films and photographs replayed T-34 history, translating quiet endurance into narratives for new eyes and ears. Snow or dew lingered on surfaces, softening harsh lines while preserving delicate traces of effort. Veterans murmured quietly to children or students, words soft, stories gentle, bridging generations through calm reflection. Each T-34 carried both memory and lesson, a silent educator of patience, perseverance, and quiet endurance. And through the muted light, the echo of history moved softly, threading past and present together. In the calm of reflection, every machine became a teacher of endurance. Evening settled gently across the landscape, light fading softly into muted gold and silver across hulls and turrets. Soldiers and civilians lingered, tracing subtle impressions along tracks, whispers blending with the hum of evening wind. Morozov noted the continuity of motion, effort, and design preserved across decades in each piece of steel. Koshkin paused beside a turret, imagining distant fields, frozen forests, and quiet roads where these machines had once tested endurance and patience. Even distant hills seemed softened, their contours folding gently into horizon, steel, and reflection. Snow or dew settled across impressions, tracks, and metal, preserving subtle signs of motion and human labor. Each T-34 stood as both witness and guide, silently narrating stories of resilience, persistence, and quiet courage. Soldiers, veterans, and civilians murmured softly, voices blending with gentle rustles of wind and distant echoes of history. Films and literature continued to carry its legacy, translating movement, frost, and perseverance into subtle lessons for new generations. And as night approached, the T-34s whispered their stories gently, waiting for those who would listen and learn. Across light and shadow, steel carried quiet continuity of memory. Night arrived with stars casting muted silver reflections over frozen treads, silent hulls and soft impressions in the earth. Soldiers, children, and visitors moved with calm steps, their presence delicate among the monuments of endurance. Morozov traced gentle lines along armor, recalling winter's long journeys and the quiet authority of movement over frozen fields. Koshkin observed subtle gradients of frost and dew, imagining hands that had guided these machines through challenge and patience. Wind whispered softly across parade grounds, memorials and distant ridges, carrying the quiet lessons embedded in steel. Each T-34 seemed to breathe gently with memory, standing sentinel over decades of human endurance, reflection and subtle triumph. Snow or frost drifted lightly, preserving delicate impressions and signs of motion, while soft shadows lengthened across hulls and treads. Visitors murmured low reflections, their voices blending with the gentle rhythm of wind, earth, and steel. Each tank held lessons in patience, courage, and quiet persistence, waiting for attentive presence to notice. And beneath the muted night, the T-34s existed as silent narrators, echoing history softly into the world. Every monument holds a whisper of the engines that once refused to stop. Morning arrived gently, painting parade grounds in soft gold and silver, where T-34 stood in quiet rows, polished steel reflecting years of memory and motion. Veterans approached slowly, careful steps echoing faintly across frost-tipped earth. Their hands, lined and worn, traced the edges of turrets and hatches, feeling once more the steel they had guided through winters and mud. Morozov observed, recalling the long decades, the frozen fields, and the quiet labor that had shaped both men and machine. Koshkin noted subtle bends and scratches, each telling stories of motion, patience, and human determination. Even distant trees seemed to lean slightly, their branches holding witness to decades of endurance, labor, and reflection. Wind carried whispers of distant voices, low and reverent, mingling with soft murmurs of veterans sharing quiet recollections. Snow or frost settled gently across tracks and impressions, preserving delicate signatures of passage and remembrance. Soldiers and civilians lingered softly, giving space and attention to the dialogue between steel and human memory. And across this gentle morning, the T-34s and their makers existed together, suspended in calm reflection. Steel remembered quietly, even as the hands that had guided it grew frail. By midday, sunlight softened further, creating gentle gradients across armor, turrets, and frozen treads. Veterans moved slowly among the tanks, their breath visible in the crisp air, voices hushed, each touch deliberate. Morozov traced subtle impressions left by decades of use and labor, reflecting on endurance, frost, and quiet diligence. Koshkin observed the interplay of light and shadow, imagining the many hands that had repaired, maintained, and guided the T-34 in silence and determination. Even distant hills seemed softened, their contours blending with steel, earth, and reflective movement. Children lingered nearby, curious and gentle, eyes wide with quiet fascination, learning history from the echoes of presence. Snow or frost drifted softly, settling on tracks and hatches, preserving subtle testimonies of motion and care. Soldiers murmured quietly, voices blending with wind and distant echoes, honoring past exertions and human effort. Each T-34 stood as both relic and living memory, its stillness a quiet testament to resilience and shared history. And in the muted midday, the veteran's touch became a gentle bridge between past action and present reflection. Time softened edges, yet the steel held every whisper of endurance. Afternoon light filtered through gentle clouds, creating muted reflections across frost-dusted hulls. Veterans moved slowly, pausing to trace treads and turret edges, feeling history beneath their fingertips. Morozov noted subtle curves and bends, each telling of frozen fields, long journeys, and quiet persistence. Koshkin observed how shadows played across armor, casting soft, shifting patterns that echoed years of labor and motion. Even distant trees seemed to bow slightly in quiet witness, leaves motionless in calm air. Snow or frost lay lightly on the ground and on machines, preserving delicate imprints of human and mechanical effort. Soldiers, civilians, and children moved quietly among the rows, careful not to disturb the soft dialogue between steel and memory. Each T-34 held stories of endurance, persistence, and silent triumphs, shared gently with those willing to listen. Wind carried low whispers of conversation, history, and recollection, blending human presence with the enduring authority of metal. And across the soft afternoon, the parade ground became a living memory, where veterans and machines existed in quiet companionship. In gentle light and muted air, every touch spoke of patience and endurance. Evening approached softly, painting the tanks in warm gold fading into muted silver. Veterans lingered, hands resting lightly on cold steel, eyes reflecting distant winters, fields and journeys now recalled in silence. Morozov reflected on the subtle dialogue between effort and endurance. Human patience mirrored in careful steel, Koshkin traced soft lines along armor, imagining the hands that had labored through frost, mud, and distant roads. Snow or frost drifted lazily, settling across impressions, tracks, and gentle depressions in metal, preserving quiet memory. Children and civilians watched respectfully, whispers low, absorbing lessons of endurance without the need for words. Soldiers murmured quietly, voices blending with wind and distant echoes, honoring both history and lived experience. Each T-34 carried stories of persistence, courage, and quiet strength, standing as both relic and teacher. Even distant hills seemed softened, contours merging with light, steel, and reflective calm. And as evening deepened, the veteran's presence and touch breathed life into memory, bridging past and present softly. The calm of dusk made even history feel intimate and near. Night settled gently, stars reflecting faintly off turreted silhouettes and polished steel. Veterans lingered, moving carefully, their steps and voices quiet, reverent, slow. Morozov traced subtle bends and impressions, imagining winter roads, frozen fields, and distant motion preserved in steel. Koshkin observed frost and shadows mingling with starlight, imagining the decades of care, labor, and endurance resting quietly across each tank. Wind whispered softly, carrying murmurs of remembrance, human presence, and history's quiet pulse. Snow or frost settled lightly on hatches and tracks, preserving delicate signatures of effort, motion, and touch. Soldiers and civilians remained nearby, voices hushed, their presence blending gently with steel, frost, and quiet reflection. Each T-34 became a vessel of memory, a repository of patience, endurance, and reverent testimony. Even distant trees seemed motionless, attentive, their branches holding witness to decades of human and mechanical presence. And through the soft night, veterans and machines existed together in calm harmony, bridging years with gentle touch and quiet reflection. The men grew old, but their creation never did. Morning light fell softly on fields dotted with the remnants of T-34, their steel surfaces dulled and rusted, yet still carrying the quiet authority of endurance. Flowers swayed gently nearby, petals brushing against cold metal, as if in reverence for decades of motion, frost, and human care. The wind whispered across distant hills, carrying memories of engineers, soldiers, and civilians whose hands had guided the machines through winters and long roads. Morozov's memory lingered in the soft light, tracing frozen landscapes, mud, and the hum of engines that once defined hope. Koshkin imagined the subtle echoes of distant treads over snow, fields, and quiet villages, now replaced by silence and calm. Even the trees seemed attentive, leaves brushing faintly against one another, murmuring of endurance and quiet presence. Snow or dew settled across turrets and tracks, preserving delicate impressions of decades gone by. Visitors passed slowly, footsteps muted, absorbing history without the need for words, each tank a bridge between past and present. The T-34, though rusted, seemed to breathe softly, holding stories of resilience, labor, and quiet courage. And beneath this gentle mourning, the machines rested, not as weapons, but as enduring memory. Steel and earth whispered together across the soft field of memory. By midday, sun warmed the rusted surfaces, bringing faint glints that spoke of durability and quiet beauty. Flowers leaned gently against turrets, stems brushing over cold steel, as if reminding the world that life continued even where history had been hard. Morozov and Koshkin's visions mingled in the air, a testament to hands and minds that had labored tirelessly, shaping machines capable of surviving harsh winters and relentless motion. Wind drifted lazily across the field, carrying faint scents of earth, grass, and distant memory, blending present calm with echoes of past exertion. Snow or dew remained in shaded nooks, softening the hard lines of treads and tracks, while preserving impressions of human care and persistence. Visitors murmured quietly, tracing gentle paths among the tanks, each step careful, reflective, reverent. Even distant hills seemed softened by light and shadow, their contours folding into horizon steel and stillness. Each rusted T-34 told stories of endurance, persistence, and human determination, offering lessons without words or haste. Soldiers, students, and civilians lingered softly, listening to the subtle dialogue of history, steel, and life. And through the warm midday glow, the tanks rested as silent teachers, guiding memory gently forward. Time had softened edges, yet the presence of effort remained unbroken. Afternoon descended in muted gold, casting long, gentle shadows across rusted hulls and soft green grass. Flowers leaned lightly over hatches, their petals touching metal as though offering quiet homage. Morozov imagined distant roads, frozen fields, and the hum of engines now silent, replaced by the whisper of wind and leaves. Koshkin traced the curve of turret edges in memory, recalling hands that had labored tirelessly, shaping endurance into steel. Even distant trees swayed faintly, their branches bending with soft motion, holding witness to human effort across decades. Snow or frost lingered in shadows, preserving delicate impressions of decades spent under sun, rain, and frost. Visitors moved carefully, voices low, absorbing quiet lessons in resilience, patience, and continuity. Each T-34, though aged and weathered, seemed to exhale softly, carrying stories of hope, endurance, and human care. Soldiers, children, and civilians alike traced the contours of steel and grass, sensing the heartbeat of history beneath their feet. And in the gentle afternoon, the T-34 rested, both relic and memory, quietly bridging past and present. Life and steel existed together, in soft, patient harmony. Evening approached with a soft, muted glow, painting the rusted hulls and flowers in shades of gold and amber. Veterans walked slowly among the tanks, their hands tracing cold metal, feeling decades of effort and endurance beneath fingertips. Morozov imagined distant winters and long roads, the hum of engines now replaced by the sigh of wind across quiet fields. Kolchkin reflected on human patience, care, and the quiet triumph embedded in every dent, scratch, and bend of the T-34 sail. Even distant hills softened into the horizon, blending earth, steel, and shadow into calm reflection. Snow, dew, or frost settled lightly in crevices and tracks, preserving subtle testimonies of time and care. Visitors murmured softly, voices blending with the hum of wind and whisper of leaves, listening to the echo of endurance embedded in metal. Each T-34 seemed to breathe gently, a guardian of memory and lesson for all who paused to notice. Soldiers and children moved with reverence, tracing the dialogue of history, steel, and quiet human effort. And across the gentle evening, the rusted tanks rested, not as weapons but as enduring witnesses to what a nation had built from almost nothing. Even in quiet decay, memory spoke softly through steel and earth. Night settled gradually, stars reflected faintly on rusted turrets and muted treads. Wind whispered across fields, carrying subtle echoes of distant hands, engines and footsteps long past. Flowers swayed gently in the darkness, brushing lightly against cold steel, preserving continuity between life and history. Morozov recalled decades of winters, frost, and tireless motion, every memory etched softly into the mind like impressions in metal. Koshkin observed the subtle gleam of moonlight across rust, imagining past hands shaping endurance into form and function. Snow or frost settled lightly across tracks and hatches, softening edges and preserving delicate testimonies of labor and persistence. Visitors moved quietly among the tanks, voices hushed, absorbing calm lessons in resilience, patience, and enduring care. Each T-34 seemed to pulse faintly with memory, standing sentinel across time, bridging decades and generations. Soldiers, civilians, and children lingered softly, feeling the dialogue between steel, earth, and quiet human endeavor. And beneath the rusted sky, the T-34s rested, not as relics of war but as memory, endurance, and testament to what a nation dared to build. Beneath the rusted sky, steel and memory breathed softly together. The field grew still under the muted night, stars twinkling faintly above the rusted sentinels. Veterans and visitors paused, touching steel with reverence, tracing contours etched by history and human care. Morozov reflected on generations who had moved alongside these machines, guiding motion through frost, mud, and quiet patience. Koshkin traced imaginary lines across hulls, remembering the hum of engines and footsteps, now replaced by wind and soft whispers. Even distant hills seemed to fold gently into the horizon, blending shadow, steel, and quiet reflection into one seamless memory. Flowers leaned softly against turrets, petals brushing against rusted metal, a gentle reminder of life flourishing amid history. Snow or dew lingered lightly, preserving subtle impressions of motion, endurance, and human care. Soldiers, children, and civilians walked slowly, absorbing lessons of patience, resilience, and quiet triumph embedded in every curve, dent, and track. Each T-34 held stories of courage, care, and endurance, standing silently as witness to the human capacity to build, endure, and remember. And across the still night, beneath the rusted sky, the T-34 rested, not as a relic of war, but as memory of what a nation dared to build when it had almost nothing left. Enduring steel, soft earth, and whispered memory became one,